Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen having asked me to tell the whole particulars about Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, I go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the sabre cut across one cheek, his sea chest following behind him in a hand barrow, first took up his lodging under our roof. He rapped on the door with a bit of stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant situated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, and the more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here, you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit." He was a very silent man by custom. All day he hung round the cove or upon the cliffs with a brass telescope. All evening he sat in a corner of the parlour next the fire and drank rum and water very strong. Mostly he would not speak when spoken to, only look up sudden and fierce, and we and the people who came about our house soon learned to let him be. Every day when he came back from his stroll, he would ask if any seafaring men had gone by along the road. At first we thought it was the want of company of his own kind that made him ask this question, but at last we began to see he was desirous to avoid them. For me, at least, there was no secret about the matter. He had taken me aside one day and promised me a silver fourpenny on the first of every month if I would only keep my weather eye open for a seafaring man with one leg. How that personage haunted my dreams. On stormy nights, when the wind shook the four corners of the house and the surf roared along the cove and up the cliffs, I would see him in 1,000 forms and with 1,000 diabolical expressions. Now the leg would be cut off at the knee, now the hip. Now he was a monstrous kind of a creature who had never had but the one leg, and that in the middle of his body. To see him leap and run and pursue me over hedge and ditch was the worst of nightmares, and altogether I paid pretty dear for my monthly fourpenny piece. But though I was so terrified by the idea of the seafaring man with one leg, I was far less afraid of the captain himself than anybody else who knew him. His stories were what frightened people worst of all. Dreadful stories they were, about hanging and walking the plank and storms at sea and the dry Tortugas and wild deeds and places on the Spanish Main. By his own account, he must have lived his life among some of the wickedest men that God ever allowed upon the sea, and the language in which he told these stories shocked our plain country people almost as much as the crimes that he described. He was only once crossed, and that was towards the end, when my poor father was far gone in a decline that took him off. Dr. Livesey came late one afternoon to see the patient, took a bit of dinner from my mother, and went into the parlour to smoke a pipe. Suddenly he, the captain that is, began to pipe up his eternal song. 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Drink and the devil had done for the rest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. The voices stopped at once, all but Dr. Livesey's. He went on as before, speaking clear and kind and drawing briskly at his pipe between every word or two. The captain glared at him for a while, and at last broke out with a villainous low oath. "Silence there between decks." "Were you addressing me, sir?" says the doctor, and when the ruffian had told him with another oath that this was so, "I have only one thing to say to you, sir," replies the doctor, "that if you keep on drinking rum, the world will soon be quit of a very dirty scoundrel." The old fellow's fury was awful. He sprang to his feet, drew and opened a sailor's clasp knife, and, balancing it open on the palm of his hand, threatened to pin the doctor to the wall. The doctor never so much as moved. He spoke to him, as before, over his shoulder, and in the same tone of voice, rather high, so that all the room might hear, but perfectly calm and steady. "If you do not put that knife this instant in your pocket, I promise upon my honour you shall hang at next assizes." Then followed a battle of looks between them. But the captain soon knuckled under, put up his weapon, and resumed his seat, grumbling like a beaten dog. It was not very long after this that there occurred the first of the events that rid us at last of the captain, though not, as you will see, of his affairs. It was a bitter cold winter, and it was plain from the first that my poor father was little likely to see the spring. One January morning, the captain had risen earlier than usual and set out down the beach, his cutlass swinging under the broad skirts of the old blue coat, his brass telescope under his arm, his hat tilted back upon his head. Mother was upstairs with father, and I was laying the breakfast table against the captain's return, when the parlour door opened and a man stepped in on whom I had never set my eyes before. He was a pale, tallowy creature, wanting 2 fingers of the left hand, and though he wore a cutlass, he did not look much like a fighter. The stranger kept hanging about just inside the inn door, peering round the corner like a cat waiting for a mouse. Once I stepped out into the road, but he immediately called me back. At last, in strode the captain, slammed the door behind him without looking to the right or left, and marched straight across the room to where his breakfast awaited him. "Bill," said the stranger. The captain spun round on his heel. He had the look of a man who sees a ghost, or the evil one, or something worse, if anything can be. "Black dog," said he. "And who else?" returned the other. "Black dog as ever was come for to see his old shipmate Billy at the Admiral Benbow Inn." "Now, look here," said the captain. "You've run me down. Here I am. Well then, speak up. What is it?" "That's you, Bill," returned Black Dog. "You're in the right of it, Billy. I'll have a glass of rum, and we'll sit down, if you please, and talk square, like old shipmates." When I returned with the rum, they were already seated on either side of the captain's breakfast table. I left them together and retired into the bar. For a long time, though I certainly did my best to listen, I could hear nothing but a low gabbling. But at last the voices began to grow higher. Then, all of a sudden, there was a tremendous explosion of oaths and other noises. The chair and table went over in a lump, a clash of steel followed, and then a cry of pain. And the next instant, I saw Black Dog in full flight, and the captain hotly pursuing, both with drawn cutlasses, and the former streaming blood from the left shoulder. Once out upon the road, Black Dog, in spite of his wound, showed a wonderful clean pair of heels and disappeared over the edge of the hill. The captain, for his part, stood staring like a bewildered man. Then he passed his hand over his eyes several times, and at last turned back into the house. "Jem," says he. "Rum." And as he spoke, he reeled a little and caught himself with one hand against the wall. I ran to fetch it, but while I was still getting it, I heard a loud fall in the parlour, and running in, beheld the captain lying full length upon the floor. At the same instant, my mother came running downstairs, and between us, we raised his head. He was breathing very loud and hard, but his eyes were closed and his face a horrible colour. It was a happy relief for us when the door opened and Dr. Livesey came in on his visit to my father. "Oh, doctor," we cried, "what shall we do? Where is he wounded?" "Wounded? A fiddlestick's end," said the doctor. "The man's had a stroke, as I warned him." He ripped up the captain's sleeve and exposed his great sinewy arm. It was tattooed in several places. "Here's luck," "a fair wind," and "Billy Bones, his fancy," were very neatly and clearly executed on the forearm, and up near the shoulder there was a sketch of a gallows and a man hanging from it. "And now, Master Billy Bones, if that be your name, we'll have a look at the colour of your blood." And with that he took his lancet and opened a vein. A great deal of blood was taken before the captain opened his eyes and looked mistily about him. Between us, with much trouble, we managed to hoist him upstairs and laid him on his bed, where his head fell back on the pillow. About noon, I stopped at the captain's door with some cooling drinks and medicines. He was lying very much as we had left him, only a little higher, and he seemed both weak and excited. "Jim," he said, "you're the only one here that's worth anything, and you know I've always been good to you. Never a month but I've given you a silver fourpenny for yourself. You'll bring me one noggin of rum now, won't you, matey?" When I brought it to him, he seized it greedily and drank it out. "Ah, aye," said he. "That's some better, sure enough. And now, matey, did that doctor say how long I was to lie here in this old berth?" "A week at least," said I. "Thunder!" he cried. "A week? I can't do that. They'd have the black spot on me by then. You saw that seafaring man today." "Black dog?" I asked. "Ah, black dog," says he. "He's a bad un, but there's worse that put him on. Now, if I can't get away now and they tip me the black spot, mind you, it's my old sea chest thereafter. I was first mate, I was. Old Flint's first mate, and I'm the only one as knows the place. He gave it me to Savannah when he lay a-dying. But you won't peach unless they get the black spot on me, or unless you see that black dog again, or a seafaring man with one leg, Jim. Him, above all." "But what is the black spot, Captain?" I asked. "That's a summons, mate. But keep your weather eye open, Jim, and I'll share with you equals, upon my honour." He wandered a little longer, his voice growing weaker, but soon after he fell into a heavy swoon-like sleep in which I left him. What I should have done had all gone well, I do not know. But as things fell out, my poor father died quite suddenly that evening, which put all other matters on one side. The day after the funeral, and about 3 o'clock of a bitter, foggy, frosty afternoon, I was standing at the door for a moment, full of sad thoughts, when I saw someone drawing slowly near along the road. He was plainly blind, for he tapped before him with a stick, and wore a great green shade over his eyes and nose. And he was hunched, as if with age or weakness, and wore a huge old tattered sea cloak with a hood that made him appear positively deformed. I never saw in my life a more dreadful-looking figure. He stopped a little from the inn, and, raising his voice in an odd sing-song, addressed the air in front of him. "Will any kind friend inform a poor blind man who has lost the precious sight of his eyes in the gracious defence of his native country, England, and God bless King George, where or in what part of this country he may now be?" "You are at the Admiral Benbow, Black Hill Cove, my good man," said I. "I hear a voice," said he, "a young voice. Will you give me your hand, my kind young friend, and lead me in?" I held out my hand, and the horrible, soft-spoken, eyeless creature gripped it in a moment like a vice. I was so much startled that I struggled to withdraw, but the blind man pulled me close up to him with a single action of his arm. "Now, boy," he said, "take me into the captain or I'll break your arm." And he gave it a wrench that made me cry out. I never heard a voice so cruel and cold and ugly as that blind man's. It cowed me more than the pain, and I began to obey him at once, walking straight in at the door and towards the parlour, where our sick old buccaneer was sitting dazed with rum. The blind man clung close to me, holding me in one iron fist and leaning almost more of his weight on me than I could carry. "Lead me straight up to him, and when I'm in view, cry out, 'Here's a friend for you, Bill. If you don't, I'll do this.' And with that he gave me a twitch that I thought would have made me faint. Between this and that, I was so utterly terrified of the blind beggar that I forgot my terror of the captain, and as I opened the parlour door, cried out the words he had ordered in a trembling voice. The poor captain raised his eyes, and at one look, the rum went out of him and left him staring sober. The expression of his face was not so much of terror as of mortal sickness. He made a movement to rise, but I do not believe he had enough force left in his body. "Now, Bill, sit where you are," said the beggar. "If I can't see, I can hear a finger stirring. Business is business. Hold out your left hand. Boy, take his left hand by the wrist and bring it near to my right." We both obeyed him to the letter, and I saw him pass something from the hollow of the hand that held his stick into the palm of the captain's, which closed upon it instantly. "And now that's done," said the blind man, and at the words he suddenly left hold of me, and, with incredible accuracy and nimbleness, skipped out of the parlour and into the road, where, as I still stood motionless, I could hear his stick go tap, tap, tapping into the distance. It was some time before either I or the captain seemed to gather our senses. But at length he drew in his hand and looked sharply into the palm. 10 o'clock, he cried. 6 hours. We'll do them yet. And he sprang to his feet. Even as he did so, he reeled, put his hand to his throat, stood swaying for a moment, and then, with a peculiar sound, fell from his whole height face foremost to the floor. I ran to him at once, calling my mother, but haste was all in vain. The captain had been struck dead by thundering apoplexy. I lost no time telling my mother all that I knew, and we saw ourselves at once in a difficult and dangerous position. Something must speedily be resolved upon, and it occurred to us at last to go forth together and seek help in the neighbouring hamlet. Bareheaded as we were, we ran out at once in the gathering evening and the frosty fog. It was already candlelight when we reached the hamlet, and I shall never forget how much I was cheered to see the yellow shine in doors and windows. But that, as it proved, was the best of the help we were likely to get in that quarter, for no soul would consent to return with us to the Admiral Benbow. The more we told of our troubles, the more they clung to the shelter of their houses. The name of Captain Flint, though it was strange to me, was well enough known to some there, and carried a great weight of terror. And the short and long of the matter was that while we could get several who were willing enough to ride to Dr. Livesey's, which lay in another direction, not one would help us to defend the inn. When each had said his say, my mother made them a speech. She would not, she declared, lose money that belonged to her fatherless boy. "If none of the rest of you dare," she said, "Jim and I dare. We'll have that chest open if we die for it." My heart was beating finely when we two set forth in the cold night upon this dangerous venture. We slipped along the hedges, noiseless and swift, nor did we see or hear anything to increase our terrors till, to our huge relief, the door of the Admiral Benbow had closed behind us. I slipped the bolt at once, and we stood and panted for a moment in the dark, alone in the house with the dead captain's body. On the floor, close to his hand, there was a little round of paper, blackened on the one side. I could not doubt that this was the black spot. "Now, Jim," she said, "that key." I felt in his pockets one after another. A few small coins, a thimble, and some thread and big needles, a piece of pigtail tobacco bitten away at the end, his gully with the crooked handle, a pocket compass, and a tinder box were all that they contained. "Perhaps it's round his neck," suggested my mother. I tore open his shirt at the neck, and there, sure enough, hanging to a bit of tarry string, we found the key. At this triumph, we were filled with hope and hurried upstairs without delay to the little room where he had slept and where his box had stood since the day of his arrival. It was like any other seaman's chest on the outside, the initial B burned on the top of it with a hot iron, and the corners somewhat smashed and broken. "Give us the key," said my mother. And though the lock was very stiff, she had turned it and thrown back the lid in a twinkling. A strong smell of tobacco and tar rose from the interior, but nothing was to be seen on the top except a suit of very good clothes, carefully brushed and folded. Under that, the miscellany began. A quadrant, a tin cannikin, several sticks of tobacco, 2 brace of very handsome pistols, a piece of bar silver, an old Spanish watch, and some other trinkets of little value and mostly of foreign make. Underneath, there was an old boat cloak, whitened with sea salt. My mother pulled it up with impatience, and there lay before us the last things in the chest. A bundle tied up in oilcloth and looking like papers, and a canvas bag that gave forth, at a touch, the jingle of gold. "I'll show these rogues that I'm an honest woman," said my mother. "I'll have my dues, and not a farthing over." And she began to count over the amount of the captain's score from the bag. It was a long, difficult business, for the coins were of all countries and sizes, doubloons and louis d'or and guineas and pieces of 8. When we were about halfway through, I suddenly put my hand upon her arm, for I had heard in the silent, frosty air a sound that brought my heart into my mouth, the tap-tapping of the blind man's stick upon the frozen road. It drew nearer and nearer, while we sat holding our breath. Then it struck sharp on the inn door, and then we could hear the handle being turned, and the bolt rattling, and then there was a long time of silence, both within and without. At last, the tapping recommenced, and to our indescribable joy and gratitude died slowly away again until it ceased to be heard. "Mother," said I, "take the whole and let's be going." But my mother, frightened as she was, would not consent to take a fraction more than was due to her. She was still arguing with me when a little low whistle sounded a good way off. "I'll take what I have," she said, jumping to her feet. "And I'll take this to square the count," said I, picking up the oilskin packet. Next moment we were both groping downstairs, and the next we had opened the door and were in full retreat. The sound of several footsteps running came already to our ears, and as we looked back in their direction, a light tossing to and fro and still rapidly advancing showed that one of the newcomers carried a lantern. "My dear," said my mother suddenly, "take the money and run on. I'm going to faint." We were just at the little bridge, by good fortune, and I helped her, tottering as she was, to the edge of the bank, where, sure enough, she gave a sigh and fell on my shoulder. I do not know how I found the strength to do it all, but I managed to drag her down the bank and a little way under the arch. I could not remain where I was, but crept back to the bank again. I was scarcely in position ere my enemies began to arrive, 7 or 8 of them, running hard. 3 men ran together, hand in hand, and I made out, even through the mist, that the middle man of this trio was the blind beggar. "Down with the door!" he cried. "Aye, aye, sir," answered 2 or 3, and a rush was made upon the Admiral Benbow, the lantern-bearer, following. And then I could see them pause and hear speeches passed in a lower key, as if they were surprised to find the door open. But the pause was brief, for the blind man again issued his commands. "In, in, in!" he shouted, and cursed them for their delay. 4 or 5 of them obeyed at once, 2 remaining on the road with the formidable beggar. There was a pause, then a cry of surprise, and then a voice shouting from the house. "Bill's dead!" "Search him, you shirking lubbers, and the rest of you aloft and get the chest!" I could hear their feet rattling up our old stairs. Promptly afterwards, fresh sounds of astonishment arose. The window of the captain's room was thrown open with a slam and a jingle of broken glass, and a man leaned out into the moonlight, head and shoulders, and addressed the blind beggar on the road below him. "Pew!" he cried. "They've been before us. Someone's turned the chest out alow and aloft." "Is it there?" roared Pew. "The money's there." The blind man cursed the money. "Flint's fist, I mean!" he cried. "We don't see it here nohow," returned the man. "It's these people of the inn! It's that boy! I wish I'd put his eyes out!" cried Pew. "Scatter and find them! Rout the house out!" Then there followed a great to-do through all our old inn. heavy feet pounding to and fro, furniture thrown over, doors kicked in until the very rocks re-echoed, and the men came out again one after another on the road and declared that we were nowhere to be found. And just then, the same whistle that had alarmed my mother and myself was once more clearly audible through the night, but this time twice repeated. "There's Dirk again," said one. "Twice. We'll have to budge, mates." "Budge, you skulk!" cried Pew. "Dirk was a fool and a coward from the first. You wouldn't mind him. They must be close by. They can't be far. You have your hands on it. Scatter and look for them dogs. Oh, shiver my soul if I had eyes!" Two of the fellows began to look here and there among the lumber, but half-heartedly, I thought, and with half an eye to their own danger all the time, while the rest stood irresolute on the road. "You have your hands on thousands, you fools, and you hang a leg. You'd be as rich as kings if you could find it, and you know it's here and you stand there malingering. There wasn't one of you dared face Bill, and I did it, a blind man. And I'm to lose my chance for you. I'm to be a poor, crawling beggar sponging for rum when I might be rolling in a coach. If you had the pluck of a weevil in a biscuit, you would catch them still." Pew's anger rose till at last, his passion completely taking the upper hand, he struck at them right and left in his blindness, and his stick sounded heavily on more than one. These, in their turn, cursed back at the blind miscreant, threatened him in horrid terms, and tried in vain to catch the stick and wrest it from his grasp. This quarrel was the saving of us, for while it was still raging, another sound came from the top of the hill on the side of the hamlet, the tramp of horses galloping. The buccaneers turned at once and ran, separating in every direction, one seaward along the cove, one slant across the hill, and so on, so that in half a minute not a sign of them remained. But Pew, there he remained, tapping up and down the road in a frenzy, and groping and calling for his comrades. "Johnny! Black dog, Dick, you won't leave old Pew, mates? Not old Pew!" Just then, the noise of horses topping the rise, and 4 or 5 riders came in sight in the moonlight, and swept at full gallop down the slope. At this, Pew turned with a scream and ran straight for the ditch into which he rolled, but he was on his feet again in a second, and made another dash, now utterly bewildered, right under the nearest of the coming horses. The rider tried to save him, but in vain. Down went Pew with a cry that rang high into the night, and the 4 hoofs trampled and spurned him and passed by. He fell on his side, then gently collapsed upon his face, and moved no more. I leapt to my feet and hailed the riders. They were pulling up, horrified at the accident, and I soon saw what they were. One, tailing out behind the rest, was a lad that had gone from the hamlet to Dr. Livesey's. The rest were revenue officers, whom he had met by the way. Pew was dead, stone dead. As for my mother, when we'd carried her up to the hamlet, a little cold water and salts and that soon brought her back again, and she was none the worse for her terror. I went with the chief revenue officer, Mr. Dance, to the Admiral Benbow, and you cannot imagine a house in such a state of smash. The very clock had been thrown down by these fellows in their furious hunt. Mr. Dance could make nothing of the scene. "They got the money, you say? Well then, Hawkins, what in fortune were they after? More money, I suppose?" "No, sir," replied I. "I believe I have the thing in my breast pocket. And to tell you the truth, I should like to get it put in safety. I thought perhaps Dr. Livesey—" "Perfectly right," he interrupted. "A gentleman and a magistrate. Dogger, you have a good horse. Take up this lad behind you." As soon as I was mounted, holding on to Dogger's belt, Mr. Dance gave the word, and the party struck out at a bouncing trot on the road to Dr. Livesey's house. We rode hard all the way till we drew up before Dr. Livesey's door. Mr. Dance told me to jump down and knock, and the door was opened almost at once by a maid. "Is Dr. Livesey in?" I asked. "No," she said. He had gone up to the hall to dine and pass the evening with the squire. "So there we go, boys," said Mr. Dance. This time, as the distance was short, I did not mount, but ran with Dogger's stirrup leather to the lodge gates, and up the long, leafless, moonlit avenue to where the white line of the hall buildings looked on either hand on great old gardens. Here Mr. Dance dismounted, and taking me along with him, was admitted at a word into the house. The servant led us into a great library, all lined with bookcases, where the squire and Dr. Livesey sat, pipe in hand, on either side of a bright fire. I'd never seen the squire so near at hand. He was a tall man, over 6 feet high, and broad in proportion, and he had a bluff, rough and ready face, all roughened and reddened and lined by his long travels.
"Come in, Mr. Dance,"
says he, very stately and condescending.
"Good evening, Dance," says the doctor, with a nod. "And good evening to you, friend Jim. What good wind brings you here?"
Mr. Dance stood up straight and stiff and told his story like a lesson.
"Mr. Dance," said the squire, "you are a noble fellow, and as for riding down that black, atrocious miscreant, I regard it as an act of virtue, sir, like stamping on a cockroach."
"And so, Jim," said the doctor, "you have the thing that they were after, have you?"
"Here it is, sir," said I, and I gave him the oilskin packet. The doctor looked it all over as if his fingers were itching to open it, but instead of doing that, he put it quietly in the pocket of his coat. Mr. Dance was further complimented, and at last dismissed.
"And now, squire," said the doctor, "you have heard of this Flint, I suppose?"
"Heard of him?" cried the squire. "He was the bloodthirstiest buccaneer that sailed. Blackbeard was a child to Flint."
"Well, I've heard of him myself," said the doctor. "But the point is, had he money?"
"Money?" cried the squire. "What were these villains after but money?"
"That we shall soon know," replied the doctor. "But what I want to know is this. Supposing that I have here in my pocket some clue to where Flint buried his treasure, will that treasure amount to much?"
"Amount, sir?" cried the squire. "It will amount to this. If we have the clue you talk about, I fit out a ship in Bristol dock and take you and Hawkins here along, and I'll have that treasure if I search a year."
"Very well," said the doctor. "Now then, if Jim is agreeable, we'll open the packet."
And he laid it before him on the table. The bundle was sewn together, and the doctor had to get out his instrument case and cut the stitches with his medical scissors. It contained a sealed paper. The doctor opened the seals with great care, and there fell out the map of an island, with latitude and longitude, soundings, names of hills and bays and inlets. It was about 9 miles long and 5 across, and had 2 fine landlocked harbours, and a hill in the centre part marked the Spyglass. There were several additions of a later date, but, above all, 3 crosses of red ink, 2 on the north part of the island, 1 in the southwest, and beside this last, in the same red ink, and in a small, neat hand, these words, "Bulk of treasure here." Over on the back, the same hand had written this further information. "Tall tree, spyglass shoulder, bearing a point to the north of nor-northeast. Skeleton Island, east-southeast and by east. 10 feet. The bar silver is in the north cache. You can find it by the trend of the east hummock 10 fathoms south of the black crag with the face on it. The arms are easy found in the sandhill, north point of North Inlet Cape, bearing east and a quarter north. J.F." That was all. But brief as it was, it filled the squire and Dr. Livesey with delight.
"Livesey,"
said the squire,
"you will give up this wretched practice at once. Tomorrow I start for Bristol. In 3 weeks' time. 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 10 days. We'll have the best ship, sir, and the choicest crew in England. Hawkins shall come as cabin boy. You, Livesey, are ship's doctor. I am admiral. We'll have favourable winds, a quick passage, and not the least difficulty in finding the spot, and money to eat, to roll in, to play duck and drink with ever after."
"Trelawney," said the doctor, "I'll go with you, and I'll go bail for it, so will Jim, and be a credit to the undertaking. There's only one man I'm afraid of."
"And who's that?" cried the squire. "Name the dog, sir."
"You," replied the doctor, "for you cannot hold your tongue. We are not the only men who know of this paper. Not one of us must breathe a word of what we've found."
"Livesey," returned the squire, "you are always in the right of it. I'll be as silent as the grave."
It was longer than the squire imagined ere we were ready for the sea. Dr. Livesey had to go to London for a physician to take charge of his practice. The squire was hard at work at Bristol, and I lived on at the Hall under the charge of old Redruth, the gamekeeper. So the weeks passed on, till one fine day there came a letter addressed to Dr. Livesey with this addition, to be opened in the case of his absence by Tom Redruth or young Hawkins. Obeying this order, we found the following news.
"Bristol, March 1st. Dear Livesey, as I do not know whether you are at the Hall or still in London, I send this in double to both places. The ship is bought and fitted. She lies at anchor, ready for sea. You never imagined a sweeter schooner. A child might sail her. 200 tons, name Hispaniola. I got her through my old friend Blandley, who has proved himself throughout the most surprising trump. The workpeople, to be sure, riggers and whatnot, were most annoyingly slow, but time cured that. It was the crew that troubled me. I wished a round score of men, and I had the worry of the deuce itself to find so much as half a dozen, till the most remarkable stroke of fortune brought me the very man that I required. I was standing on the dock when, by the merest accident, I fell in talk with him. I found he was an old sailor, kept a public house, knew all the seafaring men in Bristol, had lost his health ashore, and wanted a good berth as cook to get to sea again. He'd hobbled down there that morning, he said, to get a smell of the salt. I was monstrously touched. So would you have been, and out of pure pity I engaged him on the spot to be ship's cook. Long John Silver he's called, and has lost a leg. But that I regard it as a recommendation, since he lost it in his country's service under the immortal Hawke. Well, sir, I thought I'd only found a cook, but it was a crew I had discovered. Between Silver and myself, we got together in a few days a company of the toughest old souls imaginable, not pretty to look at, but fellows by their faces of their most indomitable spirit. I declare we could fight a frigate. Long John even got rid of 2 out of the 6 or 7 I had already engaged. He showed me in a moment that they were just the sort of freshwater swabs we had to fear in an adventure of importance. So now, Livesey, come post. Do not lose an hour if you respect me. Let young Hawkins go at once to see his mother with Redruth for a guard, and then both come full speed to Bristol. John Trelawney. Postscript. I did not tell you that Blandley, who, by the way, is to send a consort after us if we don't turn up by the end of August, had found an admirable fellow for sailing master, a stiff man, which I regret, but in all other respects, a treasure. You can fancy the excitement in which that letter put me. I was half beside myself with glee. The night passed, and the next day, after dinner, Redruth and I were on the road. I said goodbye to Mother, and the cove where I had lived since I was born. The mail picked us up about dusk at the Royal George on the Heath. I was wedged in between Redruth and a stout old gentleman, and in spite of the swift motion and the cold night air, I must have dozed a great deal from the very first, and then slept like a log uphill and down dale through stage after stage. For when I was awakened at last, it was by a punch in the ribs. "Where are we?" I asked. "Bristol," said Redruth. Mr. Trelawney had taken up his residence at an inn far down the docks to superintend the work upon the schooner. Thither we had now to walk, and our way, to my great delight, lay along the quays and beside the great multitude of ships of all sizes and rigs and nations. And I was going to see myself, to sea in a schooner with a piping boatswain and pigtailed singing seamen,
to sea, bound for an unknown island, and to seek for buried treasures. While I was still in this delightful dream, we came suddenly in front of a large inn and met Squire Trelawney, all dressed out like a sea officer in stout blue cloth, coming out of the door with a smile on his face and a capital imitation of a sailor's walk.
"Here you are," he said. "Bravo, the ship's company complete."
"Oh, sir," cried I, "when do we sail?"
"Sail," says he. "We sail tomorrow."
When I had done breakfasting the next day, the squire gave me a note addressed to John Silver at the sign of the Spyglass, and told me I should easily find the place by following the line of the docks and keeping a bright lookout for a little tavern with a large brass telescope for sign. It was a bright enough little place of entertainment. The sign was newly painted, the windows had neat red curtains, the floor was cleanly sanded. The customers were mostly seafaring men, and they talked so loudly that I hung at the door, almost afraid to enter. As I was waiting, a man came out of a side room, and at a glance I was sure he must be Long John. His left leg was cut off close by the hip, and under the left shoulder he carried a crutch, which he managed with wonderful dexterity, hopping about upon it like a bird. He was very tall and strong, with a face as big as a ham, plain and pale, but intelligent and smiling. Indeed, he seemed in the most cheerful spirits, whistling as he moved about among the tables, with a merry word or a slap on the shoulder for the more favoured of his guests. Now, to tell you the truth, from the very first mention of Long John in Squire Trelawney's letter, I had taken a fear in my mind that he might prove to be the very one-legged sailor whom I'd watched for so long at the old Benbow. But one look at the man before me was enough. I had seen the captain, and Black Dog, and the blind man, Pew, and I thought I knew what a buccaneer was like. I plucked up courage at once, crossed the threshold, and walked right up to the man where he stood, propped on his crutch, talking to a customer. "Mr. Silver, sir?" I asked, holding out the note.
"Yes, my lad,"
said he.
"Such is my name, to be sure. And who may you be?"
And then, as he saw the squire's letter, he seemed to me to give something almost like a start.
"Oh,"
said he, quite loud, and offering his hand.
"I see. You are our new cabin boy. Pleased I am to see you."
And he took my hand in his large, firm grasp. Just then, one of the customers at the far side rose suddenly and made for the door. It was close by him, and he was out in the street in a moment, but his hurry had attracted my notice, and I recognized him at a glance. It was the tallow-faced man, wanting 2 fingers, who had come first to the Admiral Benbow. "Oh!" I cried. "Stop him! It's Black Dog!"
"I don't care 2 coppers who he is,"
said Silver.
"but he hasn't paid his score. Harry, run and catch him."
One of the others who was nearest the door leapt up and started in pursuit.
"If he were Admiral Hawke, he shall pay his score,"
cried Silver, and then, relinquishing my hand,
"Who did you say he was?"
he asked.
"Black what?"
"Dog, sir," said I. "Has Mr. Trelawney not told you of the buccaneers? He was one of them."
"So!" cried Silver. "In my house! Ben, run and help Harry. One of those swabs, was he? Was that you drinking with him, Morgan? Step up here."
The man whom he called Morgan, an old grey-haired, mahogany-faced sailor, came forward pretty sheepishly, rolling his quid.
"Now, Morgan,"
said Long John very sternly,
"you never clapped your eyes on that black dog before, did you now?"
"Not I, sir," said Morgan with a salute.
You didn't know his name, did you?
No, sir.
By the powers, Tom Morgan is as good for you,
Exclaimed the landlord.
If you'd been mixed up with the like of that, you would never have put another foot in my house, you may lay to that.
And then, as Morgan rolled back to his seat, Silver added to me in a confidential whisper, "He's quite an honest man, Tom Morgan, only stupid, but come now. This won't do. I'll put on me old cocked hat and step along of you to Captain Trelawney and report this here affair. For mind you, it's serious, young Hawkins." When we got to the inn, the squire and Dr. Livesey were seated together. Long John told the story from first to last with a great deal of spirit and the most perfect truth.
"That was how it were, no word it, Hawkins,"
he would say now and again. The two gentlemen regretted that Black Dog had got away, but we all agreed there was nothing to be done, and after he'd been complimented, Long John took up his crutch and departed.
"All hands aboard by 4 this afternoon,"
shouted the squire after him.
"Aye, aye, sir,"
said Dr. Livesey.
"I don't put much faith in your discoveries as a general thing, but I will say this, John Silver suits me."
"The man's a perfect trump," declared the squire.
"And now," added the doctor, "Jim may come on board with us, may he not?"
"To be sure he may," says Squire.
"Take your hat, Hawkins, and we'll see the ship."
The Hispaniola lay some way out, and we went under the figureheads and round the sterns of many other ships, and their cables sometimes grated underneath our keel and sometimes swung above us. At last, however, we got alongside. The captain was a sharp-looking man who seemed angry with everything on board, and was soon to tell us why, for we had hardly got down into the cabin when a sailor followed us.
"Captain Smollett, sir, acts and speak with you,"
said he.
"I am always at the captain's orders. Show him in,"
said the squire. The captain, who was close behind his messenger, entered at once and shut the door behind him.
"Well, Captain Smollett, what have you to say? All well, I hope, all shipshape and seaworthy?"
"Well, sir," said the captain, "better speak plain, I believe, even at the risk of offence. I don't like this cruise, and I don't like the men."
"Perhaps, sir, you don't like the ship?"
inquired the squire.
"I can't speak as to that, sir, not having seen her tried,"
said the captain.
"Possibly, sir, you may not like your employer either,"
says the squire. But here Dr. Livesey cut in.
"Stay a bit,"
said he.
"Stay a bit. You don't, you say, like this cruise. Now, why?" "I was engaged, sir, on what we call sealed orders to sail this ship for that gentleman where he should bid me,"
said the captain.
"So far, so good. But now I find that every man before the mast knows more than I do. I don't call that fair now, do you?"
"No," said Dr. Livesey, "I don't."
"Next,"
said the captain,
"I learn we are going after treasure. Hear it from my own hands, mind you. Now, treasure is ticklish work. I don't like treasure voyages on any account, and I don't like 'em above all when they're secret. I'll tell you what I've heard myself. That you have a map of an island, that there's crosses on the map to show where treasure is, and that the island lies—"
And then he named the latitude and longitude exactly.
"I never told that," cried the squire, "to a soul." "The hands know it, sir," returned the captain. "It's my belief neither of you gentlemen know what you're about. But I'll tell you my way of it. Life or death, and a close run."
"Captain Smollett," began the doctor, "when you came in here, I'll stake my wig you meant more than this."
"Doctor," said the captain, "you are smart. When I came in here, I meant to get discharged. I had no thought that Mr. Trelawney would hear a word."
"No more I would," cried the squire. "Had Livesey not been here, I should have seen you to the deuce. As it is, I have heard you, but I think the worse of you."
"That's as you please, sir," said the captain. "You'll find I do my duty."
And with that he took his leave.
"Trelawney," said the doctor, "contrary to all my notions, I believe you have managed to get 2 honest men on board with you. That man and John Silver."
"Silver, if you like,"
cried the squire. "But as for that intolerable humbug, I declare I think his conduct unmanly, unsailorly, and downright un-English."
"Well," says the doctor, "we shall see."
I am not going to relate that voyage in detail. It was fairly prosperous. The ship proved to be a good ship, the crew were capable seamen, and the captain thoroughly understood his business. Mr. Trelawney had followed the sea, and his knowledge made him very useful, for he often took a watch himself in easy weather, and the coxswain, Israel Hands, was a careful, wily, old, experienced seaman who could be trusted at a pinch with almost anything. He was a great confidant of Long John Silver, and so the mention of his name leads me on to speak of our ship's cook, Barbecue, as the men called him. All the crew respected and even obeyed him. He had a way of talking to each and doing everybody some particular service. To me, he was unweariedly kind, and always glad to see me in the galley, which he kept as clean as a new pin, the dishes hanging up burnished and his parrot in a cage in one corner.
"Come away, Hawkins," he would say. "Come and have a yarn with John."
"Nobody more welcome than yourself, my son. Sit you down and hear the news. Here's Captain Flint. I calls my parrot Captain Flint after the famous buccaneer. Here's Captain Flint, predicting success to our voyage. Wasn't you, Captain?" And the parrot would say, with great rapidity, "Pieces of eight, pieces of eight, pieces of eight," till you wondered that it was not out of breath. "Now, that bird," he would say, "is maybe 200 years old, Hawkins. He lives forever, mostly. And if anybody's seen more wickedness, it must be the devil himself. She's sailed with England, the great Captain England, the pirate. She's been at Madagascar and at Malabar, the Suriname and Providence and Portobello. She was at the fishing up of the wrecked plate ships. She was at the boarding of the Viceroy of the Indies out at Goa, she was. And to look at her, you would think she was a baby. But you smelt powder, didn't you, Captain?" "Stand by to go about," the parrot would scream. Every man on board seemed well content, and they must have been hard to please if they'd been otherwise, for it is my belief there was never a ship's company so spoiled since Noah put to sea. Double grog was going on the least excuse. There was duff on odd days, as for instance if the squire heard it was any man's birthday, and always a barrel of apples standing broached in the waist for anyone to help himself that had a fancy. "Never knew good come of it yet," the captain said to Dr. Livesey. "Spoil forecastle hands make devils, that's my belief." But good did come of the apple barrel, as you shall hear. For if it had not been for that, we should have had no note of warning, and might all have perished by the hand of treachery. This was how it came about. It was about the last day of our outward voyage, by the largest computation. Sometime that night, or at latest before noon of the morrow, we should sight the Treasure Island. Just after sundown, when all my work was over and I was on my way to my berth, it occurred to me that I should like an apple. In I got bodily into the apple barrel, and found there was scarce an apple left. But sitting down there in the dark, what with the sound of the waters and the rocking movement of the ship, I had either fallen asleep or was on the point of doing so, when a heavy man sat down with rather a clash close by. The barrel shook as he leaned his shoulders against it, and I was just about to jump up when the man began to speak. It was Silver's voice, and before I'd heard a dozen words, I would not have shown myself for all the world, but lay there, trembling and listening, in the extreme of fear and curiosity, for from these dozen words I understood that the lives of all the honest men aboard depended upon me alone.
"No, not I,"
said Silver.
"Flint was captain. I was quartermaster along of my timber leg. The same broadside I lost me leg, old Pew lost his deadlights. It was a master surgeon, him that amputated me, out of college and all, Latin by the bucket and what not. But he was hanged like a dog and sun-dried like the rest at Corso Castle. That was Robert's men, that was, and comed of change in names of their ships, Royal Fortune and so on. Now, What a ship was christened, so let her stay, I says. So it was with the Cassandra, as brought us all safe home from Malabar after England took the Viceroy of the Indies. So it was with the old Walrus, Flint's old ship, as I've seen amuck with the red blood and fit to sink with gold.
Oh,
cried another voice, that of Dick, the youngest hand on board.
he was the flower of the float, was Flint.
Davis was a man, too, by all accounts, said Silver. I never sailed along of him, first with England, then with Flint. That's my story, and now here on my own account, in a manner of speaking. I laid by 900 safe from England, and 2,000 after Flint.
Well, said the young seaman, but all the money's gone now, innit? You daren't show face in Bristol after this.
Why, where might you suppose it was? Asked Silver.
Bristol, in banks and places, answered his companion.
It were, said the cook. It were when we weighed anchor, but my old missus has it all below, and the spyglasses sold, lease and goodwill and rigging, and the old girl's off to meet me. I would tell you where, for I trust you, but it'd make jealousy among the mates.
And can you trust your missus?
Asked the other. Gentlemen of fortune, returned the cook, usually trust little among themselves, and right they are, you may lay to it. But I have a way with me, I have. When a mate brings a slip on his cable, when his knows me, I mean, it won't be in the same world with old John. There was some that was feared of Pew, and some that was feared of Flint, but Flint his own self was feared of me. Feared he was. And proud. They was the roughest crew afloat, was Flint. The devil himself would have been feared to go to sea with them. Well, now, I tell you, I'm not a boasting man, and you see yourself how easy I keep company. But when I was quartermaster, lambs wasn't a word for Flint's old buccaneers. You may be sure of yourself in old John's ship.
But, look here, returned the voice of the coxswain, Israel Hands. Here's what I want to know, Barbecue. How long are we going to stand off and on like a blessed bumbo? I've almost had enough of Captain Smollett. He's hazed me long enough, by thunder. I want to go into that cabin, I do. I want their pickles and wines and that.
Israel, said Silver. Your head ain't much account, nor ever was, but you're able to hear, I reckon. Now here's what I say. You'll birth for it, and you'll live hard, and you'll speak soft, and you'll keep sober, till I give the word. And you may lay to that, old son.
Well, I don't say no, do I? Growled the coxswain. What I say is, when? That's what I say.
When? By the powers? Cried Silver. Well, no. If you want to know, I'll tell you when, the last moment I can manage, and that's when. Here's a first-rate seaman, Captain Smollett, sails the blessed ship for us. Here's this squire and doctor with a map and such. I don't know where it is, do I? No more to you, says you. Well, then, I mean, this squire and doctor shall find the stuff and help us to get it aboard, by the powers. Then we'll see. If I was sure of you all, sons of double Dutchmen, I'd have Captain Smollett navigate us halfway back again before I struck. But I know the sort you are. I'll finish with them at the island as soon as the blunt's on board, and a pity it is. Only one thing I claim. I claim Trelawney. I'll wring his calf's head off his body with these hands. Dick, he added, breaking off, you just jump up like a sweet lad and get me an apple to wet me pipe like. You may fancy the terror I was in. I should have leapt out and run for it if I'd found the strength, but my limbs and heart alike misgave me. I heard Dick begin to rise, and then someone seemingly stopped him, and the voice of Hans exclaimed,
Oh, stay there, don't you get sucking at that bilge, John. Let's have a go at the rum.
Dick, said Silver, I trust you. I've a gauge on the keg, mind. There's the key. You fill a pannikin and bring it up. Just then a sort of brightness fell upon me in the barrel, and looking up, I found the moon had risen and was silvering the mizzen-top and shining white on the luff of the foresail, and almost at the same time the voice of the lookout shouted, "Land ho!" There was a great rush of feet across the deck. I could hear people tumbling up from the cabin and the forecastle, and slipping in an instant outside my barrel, I dived behind the foresail, made a double towards the stern, and came out upon the open deck in time to join Hunter and Dr. Livesey in the rush for the weather bow. There, all hands were already congregated. Away to the southwest of us, we saw two low hills about a couple of miles apart, and rising behind one of them a third and higher hill whose peak was still buried in the fog. All three seemed sharp and conical in figure.
"And now, men," said the captain, "has any one of you ever seen that land ahead?"
"I have, sir," said Silver.
"I've watered there with a trader I was cooking." "The anchorage is on the south behind an islet, I fancy?" asked the captain.
"Yes, sir. The Skeleton Island, they calls it. It were a main place for pirates once, and a hand we had on board knowed all their names for it. That hill to the north they calls the Foremast Hill. There are 3 hills in a row running southward, fore, main and mizzen, sir. But the main, that's the big one with the cloud on it, they usually calls the Spyglass, by reason of a lookout they kept when they was in the anchorage cleaning." I was surprised at the coolness with which John avowed his knowledge of the island, and I own I was half frightened when I saw him drawing nearer to myself. I could scarce conceal a shudder when he laid his hand upon my arm. "Ah," says he, "this here is a sweet spot, this island, a sweet spot for a lad to get ashore on. When you want to go a bit of exploring, you just ask old John, and he'll put up a snack for you to take along." And clapping me in the friendliest way upon the shoulder, he hobbled off for it and went below. Captain Smollett, the squire, and Dr. Livesey were talking together on the quarterdeck. As soon as I was near enough to speak and not be overheard, I broke out, "Doctor, let me speak. Get the captain and squire down to the cabin and then make some pretence to send for me. I have terrible news." They spoke together for a little, and then went below, and not long after word was sent forward that Jim Hawkins was wanted in the cabin. I found them all 3 seated round the table.
"Now, Hawkins,"
said the squire,
"you have something to say? Speak up."
I did as I was bid, and, as short as I could make it, told the whole details of Silver's conversation. Nobody interrupted me till I was done, nor did any one of the 3 of them make so much as a movement, but they kept their eyes upon my face from first to last.
"Now, Captain,"
said the squire,
"you were right and I was wrong. I own myself an ass, and I await your orders."
"First point," began Mr. Smollett. "We must go on, because we can't turn back. If I gave the word to go about, they would rise at once. Second point, we have time before us, at least, until this treasure's found. Third point, there are faithful hands. We can countertake it on your own home servants, Mr. Trelawney."
"As upon myself,"
declared the squire. 3, reckoned the captain. "Ourselves make 7, counting Hawkins here now, about the honest hands. Most likely Trelawney's own men," said the doctor. "Those he had picked up for himself before he lit on Silver." Talk as we pleased, there were only 7 out of the 26 on whom we could rely. And out of these 7, 1 was a boy, so that the grown men on our side were 6 to their 19. The appearance of the island, when I came on deck next morning, was altogether changed. We brought up just where the anchor was in the chart, the mainland on one side, and Skeleton Island on the other. The place was entirely landlocked,
buried in woods, the trees coming right down to high water mark. The conduct of the men became truly threatening. They lay about the deck, growling together in talk. The slightest order was received with a black look, and grudgingly and carelessly obeyed. Mutiny, it was plain, hung over us like a thundercloud. We held a council in the cabin.
"Sir," said the captain, "if I risk another order, the whole ship will come about our ears by the run. Let's allow the men an afternoon ashore. If they all go, why, we'll fight the ship. If they none of them go, well, then we hold the cabin and God defend the right. If some go, you mark my words, sir, Silver will bring 'em aboard again as mild as lambs."
It was so decided. The captain went on deck and addressed the crew.
"My lads," said he, "we've had a hot day and are all tired and out of sorts. A turn ashore'll hurt nobody. As many as please can go ashore for the afternoon. I'll fire a gun half an hour before sundown."
I believe the silly fellows must have thought they would break their shins over treasure as soon as they were landed, for they all came out of their sulks in a moment and gave a cheer that started the echo in a faraway hill and sent the birds flying and squalling round the anchorage. The captain was too bright to be in the way. He whipped out of sight in a moment, leaving Silver to arrange the party. 6 fellows were to stay on board, and the remaining 13, including Silver, began to embark. Then it was that there came into my head the first of the mad notions that contributed so much to save our lives. If 6 men were left by Silver, it was plain our party could not take and fight the ship, and since only 6 were left, it was equally plain that the cabin party had no present need of my assistance. It occurred to me at once to go ashore. In a jiffy, I'd slipped over the side and curled up in the foresheets of the nearest boat, and almost at the same moment she shoved off. No one took notice of me, only the bow oar saying, "Is that you, Jim? Keep your head down." But Silver, from the other boat, looked sharply over and called out to know if that were me. And from that moment, I began to regret what I had done. The crews raced for the beach, but the boat I was in, being at once the lighter and the better manned, shot far ahead of her consort, and the bow had struck among the shoreside trees, and I had caught a branch and swung myself out and plunged into the nearest thicket, while Silver and the rest were still 100 yards behind. "Jim! Jim!" I heard him shouting. I paid no heed. Jumping, ducking, and breaking through, I ran straight before my nose till I could run no longer. I had crossed a marshy tract full of willows, bulrushes, and odd outlandish swampy trees, and I came to a long thicket of oak-like trees which grew low along the sand like brambles, the boughs curiously twisted, the foliage compact like thatch. The thicket stretched down from the top of one of the sandy knolls, spreading and growing taller as it went, until it reached the margin of the broad, reedy fen, through which the nearest of the little rivers soaked its way into the anchorage. And here, a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. From the side of the hill, which was steep and stony, a spout of gravel was dislodged and fell rattling and bounding through the trees. My eyes turned instinctively in that direction, and I saw a figure leap with great rapidity behind the trunk of a pine. What it was, whether bear or man or monkey, I could in no wise tell. I was now, it seemed, cut off upon both sides. Behind me the murderers, before me this lurking nondescript, and immediately I began to prefer the dangers that I knew to those I knew not. Silver himself appeared less terrible in contrast with this creature of the woods. And I turned on my heel, and looking sharply behind me over my shoulder, began to retrace my steps in the direction of the boats. Instantly the figure reappeared, and making a wide circuit, began to head me off. From trunk to trunk the creature flitted like a deer,
running man-like on 2 legs, but unlike any man that I had ever seen, stooping almost double as it ran. Yet a man it was. I could no longer be in doubt about that. I began to recall what I'd heard of cannibals. I was within an ace of calling for help. But the mere fact that he was a man, however wild, had somewhat reassured me. And my fear of Silver began to revive in proportion. I stood still, therefore, and cast about for some method of escape. And as I was so thinking, the recollection of my pistol flashed into my mind. As soon as I remembered I was not defenseless, courage glowed again in my heart, and I set my face resolutely for this man of the island, and walked briskly towards him. He was concealed by this time behind another tree trunk, but he must have been watching me closely, for as soon as I began to move in his direction, he reappeared, and took a step to meet me. Then he hesitated, drew back, came forward again, and at last, to my wonder and confusion, threw himself on his knees and held out his clasped hands in supplication. At that, I once more stopped. "Who are you?" I asked.
"Ben Gunn," he answered, and his voice sounded hoarse and awkward, like a rusty lock. "I'm poor Ben Gunn, I am, and I haven't spoke with a Christian these 3 years." I could now see that he was a white man like myself, and his features were even pleasing. His skin, wherever it was exposed, was burnt by the sun. Even his lips were black, and his fair eyes looked quite startling in so dark a face. He was clothed with tatters of old ship's canvas and old sea cloth, and this extraordinary patchwork was all held together by a system of the most various and incongruous fastenings, brass buttons, bits of stick, and loops of tarry gaskin. About his waist he wore an old brass-buckled leather belt, which is the one thing solid in his whole accoutrement. 3 years!" I cried. "Were you shipwrecked?" "Nay, mate," said he. "Marooned." I'd heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment common enough among the buccaneers, in which the offender is put ashore with a little powder and shot and left behind on some desolate and distant island. "Marooned 3 years agone," he continued, "and lived on goats since then, and berries, and oysters. Wherever a man is, says I, a man can do for himself. But, mate, my heart is sore for Christian diet. You mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now. No? Oh, well, many's a long night I've dreamed of cheese. Toasted, mostly. And woke up again. And here I were." "If ever I can get aboard again," said I, "you shall have cheese by the stone." "If ever you can get aboard again, says you?" he repeated. "Why now? Who's to hinder you?" "Not you, I know," was my reply. "And right you was," he cried. "Now you, what do you call yourself, mate?" "Jim," I told him. "Jim, Jim," says he, quite pleased, apparently. "Ah, Jim, you'll bless your stars, you will. You was the first that found me." And at this, there came suddenly a lowering shadow over his face, and he tightened his grasp upon my hand and raised a forefinger threateningly before my eyes. "Now, Jim, you tell me true. That ain't Flint's ship?" he asked. At this I had a happy inspiration. I began to believe that I'd found an ally, and I answered him at once. "It's not Flint's ship, and Flint is dead, but I'll tell you true as you ask me, there are some of Flint's hands aboard." "Not a man with one leg?" he gasped.
Silver?" I asked. "He's the cook, and the ringleader too." He was still holding me by the wrist, and at that he gave it quite a wring. "If you was sent by Long John," he said, "I'm as good as pork, and I know it." "But where was you, do you suppose?" I made my mind up in a moment, and by way of answer told him the whole story of our voyage and the predicament in which we found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done, he patted me on the head. "You're a good lad, Jim," he said, "and you're on a Clovitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Would you think it likely now that your squire would prove a liberal-minded one in case of help? What I mean is, would he be likely to come down to the tune of, say, £1,000 out of money that's as good as a man's own already?" "I'm sure he would," said I. "And a passage home?" he added with a look of great shrewdness. "Why?" I cried. "The squire's a gentleman, and besides, if we got rid of the others, we should want you to help work the vessel home." "Ah," said he, "so you would." And he seemed very much relieved. "Now I'll tell you what," he went on. "So much I'll tell you and no more. I were in Flint's ship when he buried the treasure. He and 6 along, 6 strong seamen. They was ashore nigh on a week, and us standing off and on in the old Walrus. One fine day up went the signal, and here come Flint, by himself, in a little boat, and his head done up in a blue scarf. The sun was getting up, and mortal white he looked about the cutwater, but there he was, you mind, and the 6 all dead. Dead and buried. How he done it, not a man aboard us could make out. It was battle, murder and sudden death, leastways, him against 6. Billy Bones was the mate. Long John, he was quartermaster, and they asked him where the treasure was. "Ah," says he, "you can go ashore if you like, and stay," he says, "but as for the ship, she'll beat up for more, by thunder." That's what he said. Well, I was in another ship 3 years back, and we sighted this island. "Boys," said I, "here's Flint's treasure. Let's land and find it." My captain was displeased at that, but my messmates were all of a mind and landed. 12 days they looked for it, and every day they had the worst word from me, until one fine morning all hands went aboard. "As for you, Benjamin Gunn," says they, "here's a musket," they says, "and a spade, and a pickaxe. You can stay here and find Flint's money for yourself," they says. Well, Jim, 3 years have I been here, and not a bite of Christian diet from that day to this, but now, you look here. Look at me. Do I look like a man before the mast? "No," says you. "Nor I weren't neither," I says. With that he winks and pinched me hard. "Just you mention them words to your squire, Jim," he went on. "Nor he weren't neither. That's the words." And he pinched me again in the most confidential manner. "Then," he continued, "then you'll up and you'll say this Gunn is a good man, you'll say, and he puts a precious sight more confidence in a gentleman born than in these gentlemen of fortune, having been one himself." "Well," I said, I don't understand one word that you've been saying, but that's neither here nor there, for how am I to get on board?" "Ah," said he, "that's the hitch for sure. Well, there's my boat that I made with my 2 hands. I keep her under the white rock. If the worst come to the worst, we might try that after dark. Hi! He broke out. What's that? For just then, although the sun had still an hour or two to run, all the echoes of the island awoke and bellowed to the thunder of a cannon. They have begun to fight, I cried. Follow me! And I began to run towards the anchorage, my terrors all forgotten, while close at my side the marooned man in his goatskins trotted easily and lightly. The cannon shot was followed, after a considerable interval, by a volley of small arms. Another pause, and then, not a quarter of a mile in front of me, I beheld the Union Jack flutter in the air above a wood. As soon as Ben Gunn saw the colours, he came to a halt, stopped me by the arm, and sat down. "Now," said he, "there's your friends, sure enough." "Far more likely it's the mutineers," I answered. "That," he cried. "Why, in a place like this where nobody puts in but gentlemen of fortune, Silver would fly the Jolly Roger. You don't make no doubt of that. No, that's your friends. There's been blows, too, and I reckon your friends has had the best of it. And here they are ashore in the old stockade as was made years and years ago by Flint. He was the man to have headpiece, was Flint. Barring rum, his match were never seen. He were afraid of none, not he. Only Silver." "Well," said I, "that may be so, and so be it. All the more reason that I should hurry on and join my friends." "Nay, mate," returned Ben. "Rum wouldn't bring me there where you're going, not rum wouldn't, till I see you're born gentleman and gets it on his word of honour. And when Ben Gunn is wanted, you know where to find him, Jim. Just where you found him today. And him that comes is to have a white thing in his hand, and he's to come alone. Oh, and you'll say this, Ben Gunn, says you, has reasons of his own." "Well," said I believe I understand. You have something to propose, and you wish to see the squire or the doctor, and you're to be found where I found you." "You won't forget?" he inquired anxiously. "And, Jim, if you was to see Silver, you wouldn't go for to sell Ben Gunn. Wild horses wouldn't draw it from you."
Here, he was interrupted by a loud report, and a cannonball came tearing through the trees and pitched in the sand not 100 yards from where we two were talking. The next moment, each of us had taken to his heels in a different direction. For a good hour to come, frequent reports shook the island, and balls kept crashing through the woods. I moved from hiding place to hiding place, always pursued, or so it seemed to me, by these terrifying missiles. But towards the end of the bombardment, though still I durst not venture in the direction of the stockade where the balls fell oftenest, I had begun, in a manner, to pluck up my heart again, and after a long detour to the east, crept down among the shoreside trees. The Hispaniola still lay where she had anchored, but sure enough, there was the Jolly Roger, the black flag of piracy, flying from her peak. Even as I looked, there came another red flash and another report that sent the echoes clattering, and one more round shot whistled through the air. It was the last of the cannonade. At length, I thought I might return towards the stockade. I was pretty far down on the low, sandy spit that encloses the anchorage to the east and is joined at half-water to Skeleton Island. I skirted among the woods until I'd regained the rear or shoreward side of the stockade and was soon welcomed by the faithful party. I had told my story and began to look about me. There was a log house made of unsquared trunks of pine, roof, walls and floor. The latter stood in several places as much as a foot or a foot and a half above the surface of the sand. Our chimney was a square hole in the roof. It was but a little part of the smoke that found its way out, and the rest eddied about the house and kept us coughing and piping the eye. If we'd been allowed to sit idle, we should all have fallen in the blues, but Captain Smollett was never the man for that. All hands were called up before him, and he divided us into watches, the doctor and Gray and I for one, the squire, Hunter and Joyce upon the other. Tired as we all were, 2 were sent out for firewood. The doctor was named cook, I was put sentry at the door, and the captain himself went from one to another, keeping up our spirits and lending a hand wherever it was wanted. From time to time, the doctor came to the door for a little air and to rest his eyes, which were almost smoked out of his head. And whenever he did so, he had a word for me.
"That man Smollett," he said once, "is a better man than I am. And when I say that, it means a deal, Jim."
Another time he came and was silent for a while. Then he put his head on one side and looked at me. "Is this Ben Gunn a man?" he asked. "I do not know, sir," said I. "I'm not very sure whether he's sane."
"If there's any doubt about the matter, he is," returned the doctor. "A man who has been 3 years biting his nails on a desert island, Jim, can't expect to appear as sane as you or me." When we'd eaten our pork and each had a good stiff glass of brandy grog, the 3 chiefs got together in a corner to discuss our prospects. It appears they were at their wits' end what to do, the stores being so low that we must have been starved into surrender long before help came. But our best hope, it was decided, was to kill off the buccaneers until they either hauled down their flag or ran away with the Hispaniola. From 19, they were already reduced to 15, 2 others were wounded, and 1 at least severely wounded if he were not dead. Every time we had a crack at them, we were to take it, saving our own lives with the extremest care. "So," the doctor added, "if we are not all shot down first, they'll be glad to be packing in the schooner. It's always a ship, and they can get to buccaneering again, I suppose." I was dead tired, as you may fancy, and when I got to sleep, which was not till after a great deal of tossing, I slept like a log of firewood. The rest had long been up and had already breakfasted when I was awakened by a bustle and the sound of voices.
"Flag of truce!"
I heard someone say, and then immediately after, with a cry of surprise,
"Silver himself!"
And at that up I jumped, and rubbing my eyes ran to a loophole in the wall. Sure enough, there were 2 men, one of them waving a white cloth, the other no less a person than Silver himself, standing placidly by.
"Keep indoors, men," said the captain. 10 to 1, this is a trick."
Then he hailed the buccaneer.
"Who goes? Stand or we fire."
"Flag of truce!"
cried Silver.
"And what do you want with your flag of truce?"
he cried. This time it was the other man who replied.
"Captain Silver, sir, to come on board and make terms," he shouted.
"Captain Silver? Don't know him. Who's he?"
cried the captain. Long John answered for himself.
"Me, sir. These poor lads have chosen me captain after your desertion, sir. We're willing to submit if we can come to terms and no bones about it. All I ask is your word, Captain Smollett, to let me safe and sound out of this here stockade, and 1 minute to get out a shot before a gun is fired." "My man," said Captain Smollett, "I have not the slightest desire to talk to you. If you wish to talk to me, you can come, that's all. If there's any treachery, it'll be on your side, and the Lord help you." "Ha! That's enough, Captain," shouted Long John cheerily. "A word from you's enough. I know a gentleman, and you may lay to that."
Silver had terrible hard work getting up the knoll. What with the steepness of the incline, the thick tree stumps and the soft sand, he and his crutch were as hopeless as a ship in stays, but he stuck to it like a man, in silence, and at last arrived before the captain, whom he saluted in the handsomest style.
"If you have anything to say, my man, better say it," said the captain.
"Well, here it is," said Silver. "We want that treasure, and we'll have it. That's our point. You would just as soon save your lives, I reckon, and that's yours. You have a chart, haven't you?"
"That's as may be," replied the captain.
"Oh, well, you have, I know that," returned Long John. "You needn't be so husky with a man. You give us the chart to get the treasure by, and drop shooting poor seamen, and we'll offer you a choice. Either you come aboard along of us once the treasure's shipped, and then I'll give you my affidavy upon my word of honour to clap you somewhere safe ashore. Or, if that ain't to your fancy, then you can stay here. We'll divide stores with you man for man, and I'll give my affidavy as before to speak the first ship I sight and send 'em here to pick you up. Now you'll own that's talking. Handsomer you couldn't look to get." Captain Smollett knocked out the ashes of his pipe in the palm of his left hand.
"Is that all?"
he asked.
"Every last word, by thunder?"
answered John.
"Refuse that, and you've seen the last of me but musket balls." "Very good," said the captain. "Now you'll hear me. If you'll come up one by one unarmed, I'll engage to clap you all in irons and take you home to a fair trial in England. If you won't, I'll see you all to Davy Jones. You can't find the treasure. You can't sail a ship. There's not a man among you fit to sail the ship. You can't fight us. Your ship's in irons, Master Silver. You're on a lee shore, and so you'll find. I stand here and tell you so, and they're the last good words you'll get from me, for in the name of heaven, I'll put a bullet in your back when I next meet you. Tramp, my lad. Bundle out of this, please, hand over hand, and double quick."
Silver's face was a picture. His eyes started in his head with wrath. Then he spat into the spring.
"There!"
he cried.
"That's what I think of ye. Before an hour's out, I'll stove in your old blockhouse like a rum puncheon. Ha! Laugh, by thunder, laugh! Before an hour's out, you'll laugh upon the other side. Them that die will be the lucky ones."
And with a dreadful oath, he stumbled off, ploughed down the sand, and disappeared in an instant afterwards among the trees. The captain looked on for a while in silence. Then he spoke.
"My lad," said he, "I've given Silver a broadside. I pitched it in red hot on purpose. And before the hour's out, as he said, we shall be boarded. We're outnumbered, I needn't tell you that. But we fight in shelter. Doctor, you will take the door. Hunter, take the east side there. Joyce, you stand by the west, my man. Mr. Trelawney, you're the best shot. You and Gray will take this long north side with the 5 loopholes. Hawkins, neither you nor I are much account at the shooting. We'll stand by to load and bear a hand." As soon as the sun had climbed above our girdle of trees, it fell with all its force upon the clearing. Soon the sand was baking and the resin melting in the logs of the blockhouse. Jackets and coats were flung aside, shirts thrown open at the neck and rolled up to the shoulders, and we stood there, each to his post, in a fever of heat and anxiety. An hour passed away. "Hang them," said the captain. "This is as dull as the doldrums." Suddenly, Joyce whipped up his musket and fired. The report had scarcely died away ere it was repeated and repeated from without in a scattering volley from every side of the enclosure. Several bullets struck the log house, but not one entered, and as the smoke cleared away and vanished, the stockade and the woods around it looked as quiet and empty as before. Not a bough waved,
Not the gleam of a musket barrel betrayed the presence of our foes. Suddenly, with a loud huzzah, a little cloud of pirates leapt from the woods on the north side and ran straight on the stockade. At the same moment, the fire was once more opened from the woods, and a rifle ball sang through the doorway and knocked the doctor's musket into bits. The boarders swarmed over the fence like monkeys. Squire and Grey fired again and yet again. 3 men fell, 1 forwards into the enclosure, 2 back on the outside. But of these, 1 was evidently more frightened than hurt, for he was on his feet again in a crack and instantly disappeared among the trees. 2 had bit the dust, 1 had fled, 4 had made good their footing inside our defences, while from the shelter of the woods 7 or 8 men, each evidently supplied with several muskets, kept up a hot though useless fire on the log house. The 4 who had boarded made straight before them for the building, shouting as they ran, and the men among the trees shouted back to encourage them. Several shots were fired, but such was the hurry of the marksmen that not one appeared to have taken effect. In a moment, the 4 pirates had swarmed up the mound and were upon us. The head of Job Anderson, the boatswain, appeared at the middle loophole. "At 'em, all hands! All hands!" he roared in a voice of thunder. At the same moment, another pirate grasped Hunter's musket by the muzzle, wrenched it from his hands, plucked it through the loophole, and with one stunning blow laid the poor fellow senseless on the floor. Meanwhile, a 3rd, running unharmed all round the house, appeared suddenly in the doorway and fell with his cutlass on the doctor. Our position was utterly reversed. A moment since we were firing under cover at an exposed enemy. Now it was we who lay uncovered and could not return a blow. The log house was full of smoke, to which we owed our comparative safety. Cries and confusion, the flashes and reports of pistol shots, and one loud groan rang in my ears. "Out, lads! Out, and fight 'em in the open! Cutlasses!" cried the captain. I snatched a cutlass from the pile and dashed out of the door into the clear sunlight. Someone was close behind, I knew not who. Right in front, the doctor was pursuing his assailant down the hill and sent him sprawling on his back with a great slash across the face. "Round the house, lads! Round the house!" cried the captain. Mechanically, I obeyed, turned eastwards, and with my cutlass raised, ran round the corner of the house. Next moment, I was face to face with Anderson. He roared aloud, and his hanger went up above his head, flashing in the sunlight. I had not time to be afraid, but as the blow still hung impending, leapt in a trice upon one side, and, missing my foot in the soft sand, rolled headlong down the slope. When I had first sallied from the door, the other mutineers had been already swarming up the palisade to make an end of us. One man, in a red nightcap, with his cutlass in his mouth, had even got upon the top and thrown a leg across. Well, so short had been the interval that, when I found my feet again, all was in the same posture. The fellow with the red nightcap still halfway over, another still just showing his head above the top of the stockade. And yet, in this breath of time, the fight was over, and the victory was ours. Grey, following close behind me, had cut down the big boatswain ere he had time to recover from his lost blow. Another had been shot at a loophole in the very act of firing into the house, and now lay in agony, the pistol still smoking in his hand. A 3rd, as I had seen, the doctor disposed of at a blow. Of the 4 who had scaled the palisade, 1 only remained unaccounted for, and he, having left his cutlass on the field, was now clambering out again with the fear of death upon him. In 3 seconds, nothing remained of the attacking party but the 5 who had fallen, 4 on the inside and 1 on the outside of the palisade. The house was by this time somewhat cleared of smoke, and we saw at a glance the price we had paid for victory. Hunter lay beside his loophole, stunned. Joyce, by his, shot through the head, never to move again. While right in the centre, the squire was supporting the captain, one as pale as the other. "The captain's wounded," said Mr. Trelawney. "Have they run?" asked Mr. Smolin. "All that could, you may be bound," returned the doctor. "But there's 5 of them will never run again." Out of the 8 men who had fallen in the action, only 3 still breathed. That one of the pirates who had been shot at the loophole, Hunter and Captain Smollett. And of these, the first 2 were as good as dead.
The mutineer, indeed, died under the doctor's knife, and Hunter, do what we could, never recovered consciousness in this world. As for the captain, his wounds were grievous indeed, but not dangerous. No organ was fatally injured. Anderson's ball had broken his shoulder blade and touched the lung, not badly. The second had only torn and displaced some muscles in the calf. After dinner, the squire and the doctor sat by the captain's side a while in consultation, and when they had talked, the doctor took up his hat and pistols, girt on a cutlass, put the chart in his pocket, and with a musket over his shoulder, crossed the palisade on the north side and set off briskly through the trees. Gray and I were sitting together at the far end of the blockhouse, and Gray took his pipe out of his mouth and fairly forgot to put it back again, so thunderstruck he was at this occurrence.
"Why, in the name of Davy Jones," said he, "is Dr. Livesey mad?"
"Why, no," says I. "If I am right, he's going to see Ben Gunn." I was right, as appeared later. But in the meantime, I began to get another thought into my head, which was not by any means so right. The scheme I had was to find a white rock I had observed last evening and ascertain whether it was there that Ben Gunn had hidden his boat, a thing quite worth doing, as I still believe. But as I was certain I should not be allowed to leave the enclosure, my only plan was to take French leave and slip out when nobody was watching. As things fell out, I found an admirable opportunity. The squire and Gray were busy helping the captain with his bandages. The coast was clear. I made a bolt for it over the stockade and into the thickest of the trees, and before my absence was observed, I was out of cry of my companions. It was already late in the afternoon, although still warm and sunny. I took the cover of some thick bushes and crept warily up to the ridge of the spit. The anchorage under lee of Skeleton Island lay still and leaden as when first we entered it. The Hispaniola, in that unbroken mirror, was exactly portrayed from the truck to the waterline, the Jolly Roger hanging from her peak. Alongside lay one of the gigs, silver in the stern sheets, him I could always recognize, while a couple of men were leaning over the stern bulwarks, one of them with a red cap, the very rogue that I'd seen some hours before stride legs upon the palisade. Apparently they were talking and laughing, though at that distance, upwards of a mile, I could of course hear no word of what was said. All at once, there began the most horrid, unearthly screaming, which at first startled me badly, though I had soon remembered the voice of Captain Flint, and even thought I could make out the bird by her bright plumage as she sat perched upon her master's wrist. Soon after, the jolly boat shoved off and pulled for shore, and the man with the red cap and his comrade went below by the cabin companion. Just about the same time, the sun had gone down behind the spyglass, and as the fog was collecting rapidly, it began to grow dark in earnest. I saw I must lose no time if I were to find the boat that evening. The White Rock, visible enough above the brush, was still some eighth of a mile farther down the spit, and it took me a goodish while to get up with it, crawling, often on all fours, among the scrub. Right below it, there was a small hollow of green turf, hidden by banks and a thick underwood about knee-deep, and in the centre of the dell, sure enough, was Ben Gunn's boat. Homemade, if ever anything was homemade, a rude, lopsided framework of tough wood, and stretched upon that a covering of goatskin with the hair inside. The thing was extremely small, even for me, and I can hardly imagine that it could have floated with a full-sized man. I had not then seen a coracle, such as the ancient Britons made, but I have seen one since, and I can give you no fairer idea of Ben Gunn's boat than by saying it was like the first and the worst coracle ever made. Well, now that I had found the boat, you would have thought I had had enough of truantry for once, but in the meantime I had taken another notion. This
was to slip out under cover of the night, cut the Hispaniola adrift, and let her go ashore where she fancied. I'd quite made up my mind that the mutineers, after their repulse of the morning, had nothing nearer their hearts than to up anchor and away to sea. This, I thought, it would be a fine thing to prevent. And now that I'd seen how they left their watchman unprovided with a boat, I thought it might be done with little risk. It was a night out of 10,000 for my purpose. The fog had now buried all heaven. As the last rays of daylight dwindled and disappeared, absolute blackness settled down on Treasure Island. I shouldered the coracle and groped my way stumblingly out of the hollow. The ebb had already run some time, and I had to wade through a long belt of swampy sand, where I sank several times above the ankle before I came to the edge of the retreating water, and wading a little way in, set my coracle keel downwards on the surface. She was the most cross-grained, lopsided craft to manage. Turning round and round was the manoeuvre she was best at, and I'm very sure I never should have made the ship at all but for the tide. By good fortune, paddle as I pleased, the tide was still sweeping me down. And there lay the Hispaniola right in the fairway, hardly to be missed. First she loomed before me like a blot of something yet blacker than darkness. Then her spars and hull began to take shape, and the next moment, as it seemed, I was alongside of her hawser and had laid hold. The hawser was as taut as a bowstring. I took out my gully, opened it with my teeth, and cut one strand after another, till the vessel only swung by two. And then I lay quiet, waiting to sever these last, when the strain should be lightened by a breath of wind. All this time, I had heard the sound of loud voices from the cabin. But to say truth, my mind had been so entirely taken up with other thoughts that I had scarcely given ear. Now, however, when I had nothing else to do, I began to pay more heed. One I recognized for the coxswain's Israel Hands. The other was, of course, my friend of the red nightcap. Both men were plainly the worse for drink. But they were not only tipsy. It was plain that they were furiously angry. Oaths flew like hailstones, and every now and then there came forth such an explosion as I thought was sure to end in blows. But each time the quarrel passed off, and the voices grumbled lower for a while, until the next crisis came, and, in its turn, passed away without result. At last the breeze came. The schooner sidled and drew nearer in the dark. I felt the hawser slacken, and with a good tough effort cut the last fibres through. The breeze had but little action on the coracle, and I was almost instantly swept against the bows of the Hispaniola. At the same time, the schooner began to turn upon her heel, spinning slowly end for end across the current. I wrought like a fiend, for I expected every moment to be swamped, and since I found I could not push the coracle directly off, I now shoved straight astern. The current turned at right angles, sweeping round through the narrows for the open sea. Suddenly, the schooner in front of me gave a violent yaw, turning perhaps through 20 degrees, and almost at the same moment one shout followed another from on board. I could hear feet pounding on the companion ladder, and I knew that the two drunkards had at last been interrupted in their quarrel and awakened to a sense of their disaster. I lay down flat in the bottom of that wretched skiff and devoutly recommended my spirit to its maker. At the end of the straits, I made sure we must fall into some bar of raging breakers, where all my troubles would be ended speedily, and though I could perhaps bear to die, I could not bear to look upon my fate as it approached. So I must have lain for hours, continually beaten to and fro upon the billows, now and again wetted with flying sprays, and never ceasing to expect death at the next plunge. Gradually weariness grew upon me, a numbness, an occasional stupor fell upon my mind even in the midst of my terrors, until sleep at last supervened, and in my sea-tossed coracle I lay and dreamed of home and the old Admiral Benbow.
It was broad day when I awoke and found myself tossing at the southwest end of Treasure Island. Right in front of me, not half a mile away, I beheld the Hispaniola under sail. She was under her mainsail and 2 jibs, and the beautiful white canvas shone in the sun like snow or silver. I presumed the men on board were going round the island on their way back to the anchorage. Presently she began to fetch more and more to the westward, so that I thought they had sighted me and were going about to chase. At last, however, she fell right into the wind's eye, was taken dead aback, and stood there a while helpless with her sails shivering. It became plain to me that nobody was steering. And if so, where were the men? Either they were dead drunk or had deserted her, I thought, and perhaps, if I could get on board, I might return the vessel to her captain. I set myself with all my strength and caution to paddle after her. Once I shipped a sea so heavy that I had to stop and bail, but gradually I got into the way of the thing and guided my coracle among the waves with only now and then a blow upon her bows and a dash of foam in my face. I was now gaining rapidly on the schooner. I could see the brass glisten on the tiller as it banged about, and still no soul appeared upon her decks. I could not choose but suppose she was deserted. If not, the men were lying drunk below, where I might batten them down, perhaps, and do what I chose with the ship. I was not 100 yards from her when the wind came again in a clap. She filled on the port tack and was off, stooping and skimming like a swallow. My first impulse was one of despair, but my second was towards joy. Round she came, till she was broadside onto me, round still, till she had covered a half, and then 2/3, and then 3/4 of the distance that separated us. I could see the waves boiling white under her forefoot. Immensely tall she looked to me from my low station in the coracle. I had scarce time to think, scarce time to act and save myself. I was on the summit of one swell when the schooner came swooping over the next. The bowsprit was over my head. I sprang to my feet and leapt, stamping the coracle under water. With one hand I caught the jib boom, while my foot was lodged between the stay and the brace, and, as I still clung there panting, a dull blow told me that the schooner had charged down upon and struck the coracle, and that I was left without retreat on the Hispaniola. I crawled along the bowsprit and tumbled head foremost on the deck. There were the 2 watchmen, sure enough. Redcap on his back, as stiff as a handspike, with his arms stretched out like those of a crucifix. Israel Hands propped against the bulwarks, his chin on his chest, his hands lying open before him on the deck, his face as white under its tan as a tallow candle. At the same time, I observed around both of them splashes of dark blood upon the planks, and began to feel sure that they had killed each other in their drunken wrath. While I was thus looking and wondering, in a calm moment when the ship was still, Israel Hands turned partly round with a low moan. The moan, which told of pain and deadly weakness, and the way in which his jaw hung open, went right to my heart. But when I remembered the talk I'd overheard from the apple barrel, all pity left me. I walked aft until I reached the mainmast. "Mr. Hands," said I, "I've come aboard to take possession of this ship, and you'll please regard me as your captain until further notice." He looked at me sourly, his chin all the while on his breast.
"I reckon," he said at last, "I reckon, Captain Hawkins, you'll kind of want to get ashore now. Suppose we talks?"
"Why, yes," says I, "with all my heart, Mr. Hands. Say on."
"This man," he began, nodding feebly at the corpse. "O'Brien were his name. Rank Islander. This man and me got the canvas on her, meaning for to sail her back. Well, he's dead now, yes. As dead as bilge. And who's to sail this ship, I don't see. With that eye, it gives you a hint you ain't that man as far as I can tell. Now, look here. You gives me food and drink and an old scarf or handkerchief to tie my wound up, you do, and I'll tell you how to sail her. And that's about square away, I take it.
I'll tell you one thing, says I. I'm not going back to Captain Kidd's anchorage. I mean to get into North Inlet and beach her quietly there.
Oh, to be sure you does, he cried. Why, I ain't such an infernal lubber after all I can see, can't I? I've tried my fling, I have, and I've lost, and it's you as the wind of me. North Inlet? Why, I haven't no choice, not I. I'd help you sail her up to Execution Dock, by thunder, so I would.
We struck our bargain on the spot. In 3 minutes, I had the Hispaniola sailing easily before the wind along the coast of Treasure Island. Then I lashed the tiller and went below to my own chest, where I got a soft silk handkerchief of my mother's. With this, and with my aid, Hans bound up the great bleeding stab he'd received in the thigh, and after he'd eaten a little and had a swallow or two of brandy, he began to pick up visibly. I was greatly elated with my new command. My conscience, which had smitten me hard for my desertion, was quieted by the great conquest I had made. I should, I think, have had nothing left me to desire, but for the eyes of the coxswain as they followed me derisively about the deck, and the odd smile that appeared continually on his face.
"Captain,"
said he at length with that same uncomfortable smile,
"I'll take it kind if you'd step down into that there cabin and get me all a shiver my timbers. I can't hit the name on it. Well, you get me a bottle of wine, Jim. This here brandy's too strong for my head."
All the time he kept smiling and putting his tongue out in the most guilty, embarrassed manner, so that a child could have told that he was bent on some deception. "All right," I answered. "I'll bring you port, Mr. Hans, but I'll have to dig for it." With that, I scuttled down the companion with all the noise I could, slipped off my shoes, ran quietly along the sparred gallery, mounted the forecastle ladder, and popped my head out of the fore companion. He had risen from his position to his hands and knees, and though his leg obviously hurt him pretty sharply when he moved, for I could hear him stifle a groan, yet it was at a good rattling rate that he trailed himself across the deck. In half a minute he had reached the port scuppers and picked out of a coil of rope a long knife, or rather a short dirk, discoloured to the hilt with blood. He looked upon it for a moment, tried the point upon his hand, and then, hastily concealing it in the bosom of his jacket, trundled back again into his old place against the bulwark. I stole back to the cabin, slipped once more into my shoes, and laid my hand at random on a bottle of wine, and now, with this for an excuse, I made my reappearance on the deck. Hans lay as I had left him, all fallen together in a bundle, and with his eyelids lowered as though he were too weak to bear the light. He looked up, however, at my coming, knocked the neck off the bottle like a man who had done the same thing often, and took a good swig. Then he lay quiet for a little. All told, we had scarce 2 miles to run, but the navigation was delicate. The entrance to this northern anchorage was not only narrow and shoal, but lay east and west, so that the schooner must be nicely handled to be got in. I think I was a good, prompt subaltern, and I am very sure that Hans was an excellent pilot, for we went about and dodged in, shaving the banks with a certainty and a neatness that were a pleasure to behold. Scarcely had we passed the heads before the land closed around us. The shores of North Inlet were as thickly wooded as those of the southern anchorage, but the space was longer and narrower, and more like what in truth it was, the estuary of a river.
"Now," said Hans, "look there. Here's a pet bit to beach a ship in. Fine flat sand, never a cat's paw, trees all around of it. And now, boy, you stand by. She's too much way on her. Starboard a little, so steady. Starboard, larboard a little. Steady. Steady.
So he issued his commands, while I breathlessly obeyed, till all of a sudden he cried, "Now, my hearty, luff!" And I put the helm hard up, and the Hispaniola swung round rapidly and ran stem on for the low wooded shore. The excitement of these last manoeuvres had somewhat interfered with the watch I had kept hitherto, sharply enough, upon the coxswain. Even then, I was still so much interested waiting for the ship to touch that I might have fallen without a struggle for my life had not a sudden disquietude seized upon me and made me turn my head. There was Hans, already halfway towards me with the dirk in his right hand. We must both have cried out aloud when our eyes met, but while mine was the shrill cry of terror, his was a roar of fury like a charging bull's. He threw himself forward, and I leapt sideways towards the bows. As I did so, I left hold of the tiller, which sprang sharp to leeward, and I think this saved my life, for it struck Hans across the chest and stopped him for the moment dead. Before he could recover, I was safe out of the corner where he had me trapped with all the deck to dodge about. Just forward of the mainmast I stopped, drew my pistol from my pocket, took a cool aim, though he'd already turned and was once more coming directly after me, and drew the trigger. The hammer fell, but there followed neither flash nor sound. The priming was useless with seawater. I cursed myself for my neglect. Why had not I long before reprimed and reloaded my only weapon? Then I should not have been, as now, a mere fleeing sheep before this butcher. Wounded as he was, it was wonderful how fast he could move, his grizzled hair tumbling over his face, and his face itself as red as a red ensign with his haste and fury. One thing I saw plainly. I must not simply retreat before him, or he would speedily hold me boxed into the bows, as a moment since he had so nearly boxed me in the stern. I placed my palms against the mainmast, which was of a goodish bigness, and waited, every nerve upon the stretch. Seeing that I meant to dodge, he also paused, and a moment or two passed in feints on his part and corresponding movements upon mine. While things stood thus, suddenly the Hispaniola struck, staggered, ground for an instant in the sand, and then, swift as a blow, canted over to the port side till the deck stood at an angle of 45 degrees. We were both of us capsized in a second, and both of us rolled almost together into the scuppers. The sudden canting of the ship had made the deck no place for running on. I had to find some new way of escape. Quick as thought, I sprang into the mizzen shrouds, rattled up hand over hand, and did not draw breath till I was seated on the cross trees. I had been saved by being prompt. The dirk had struck not half a foot below me as I pursued my upward flight, and there stood Israel Hans, with his mouth open and his face upturned to mine, a perfect statue of surprise and disappointment. Now that I had a moment to myself, I lost no time in changing the priming of my pistol. My new employment struck Hans all of a heap. He began to see the dice going against him, and after an obvious hesitation, he also hauled himself heavily into the shrouds and, with the dirk in his teeth, began slowly and painfully to mount. It cost him no end of time and groans to haul his wounded leg behind him, and I had quietly finished my arrangements before he was much more than a third of the way up. "One more step, Mr. Hans," said I, "and I'll blow your brains out." He stopped instantly. I could see by the working of his face that he was trying to think. "Jim," says he, I reckon we're fouled, you and me, and we'll have to sign articles. I've had you but for that there lurch, but I don't have no luck, not I. And I reckon I'll have to strike, which comes hard, you see, for a master mariner to a ship's younker like you, Jim." I was drinking in his words and smiling away as conceited as a cock upon a wall, when, all in a breath, Back went his right hand over his shoulder. Something sang like an arrow through the air. I felt a blow and then a sharp pang, and there I was, pinned by the shoulder to the mast. In the horrid pain and surprise of the moment, my pistol went off and escaped out of my hand. It did not fall alone. With a choked cry, the coxswain loosed his grasp upon the shrouds and plunged head first into the water. He rose once to the surface in a lather of foam and blood, and then sank again for good. I was no sooner certain of this than I began to feel sick, faint, and terrified. The hot blood was running over my back and chest. The dirk, where it had pinned my shoulder to the mast, seemed to burn like a hot iron. It was my first thought to pluck it forth, but either it stuck too hard or my nerve failed me, and I desisted with a violent shudder. Oddly enough, that very shudder did the business. The knife, in fact, had held me by a mere pinch of skin, and this the shudder tore away. The blood ran down the faster, to be sure, but I was my own master again, and only tacked to the mast by my coat and shirt. These last I broke through with a sudden jerk and then regained the deck by the starboard shrouds. I went below and did what I could for my wound. It pained me a good deal and still bled freely, but it was neither deep nor dangerous, nor did it greatly gall me when I used my arm. I was now alone upon the ship. The tide had just turned. The sun was within so few degrees of setting that already the shadow of the pines upon the western shore began to reach right across the anchorage and fall in patterns on the deck. I scrambled forward and looked over. It seemed shallow enough, and holding the cut hawser in both hands for a last security, I let myself drop softly overboard. The water scarcely reached my waist, and I waded ashore in great spirits. About the same time, the sun went fairly down, and the breeze whistled low in the dusk among the tossing pines. I had nothing nearer my fancy than to get home to the stockade and boast of my achievements. Possibly I might be blamed a bit for my truantry, but the recapture of the Hispaniola was a clenching answer, and I hoped that even Captain Smollett would confess I had not lost my time. Gradually the night fell blacker. It was all I could do to guide myself even roughly towards my destination. In the low ground where I wandered, I kept tripping among bushes and rolling into sandy pits. Suddenly, a kind of brightness fell about me. I looked up. A pale glimmer of moonbeams had alighted on the summit of the spyglass, and soon after, I saw something broad and silvery moving low down behind the trees, and knew the moon had risen. With this to help me, I passed rapidly over what remained to me of my journey, and sometimes walking, sometimes running, impatiently drew near to the stockade. Yet, as I began to thread the grove that lies before it, I slacked my pace and went a trifle warily. It would have been a poor end of my adventures to get shot down by my own party in mistake. At last, I came right down upon the borders of the clearing. The western end was already steeped in moonshine. The rest and the blockhouse itself still lay in a black shadow checkered with long, silvery streaks of light. I stole round by the eastern end, keeping close in shadow, and at a convenient place where the darkness was thickest, crossed the palisade. To make assurance surer, I got upon my hands and knees and crawled without a sound towards the corner of the house. As I drew nearer, my heart was suddenly and greatly lightened. It is not a pleasant noise in itself, and I have often complained of it at other times, but just then it was like music to hear my friends snoring together so loud and peaceful in their sleep. By this time, I had got to the door and stood up. All was dark within, so that I could distinguish nothing by the eye. With my arms before me, I walked steadily in. I should lie down in my own place, I thought, with a silent chuckle, and enjoy their faces when they found me in the morning. My foot struck something yielding. It was a sleeper's leg, and he turned and groaned, but without awaking. And then, all of a sudden, a shrill voice broke forth out of the darkness.
Beat the bike! Beat the bike! Beat the bike! Beat the bike! Beat the bike!
It was Silver's green parrot, Captain Flint. The sleepers awoke and sprang up, and with a mighty oath the voice of Silver cried, "Who goes?" I turned to run, struck violently against one person, recoiled, and ran full into the arms of a second who, for his part, closed upon and held me tight. "Bring a torch, Dick," said Silver. And one of the men left the log house and presently returned with a lighted brand. The red glare of the torch showed me the worst of my apprehensions realized. The pirates were in possession of the house and stores. There were 6 of the buccaneers, all told. The parrot sat, preening her plumage, on Long John's shoulder. "So," said he, "here's Jim Hawkins, shiver my timbers, dropped in like a welcome, I take that friendly." And thereupon he sat down across the brandy cask and began to fill a pipe. "Now, you see, Jim, so be as you are here," says he. "I'll give you a piece of my mind. I've always liked you, I have, for a lad of spirit. I always wanted you to join and take your share and die a gentleman. And now, my cock, you've got to. I don't say nothing as to your being in our hands, though there you are, and you may lay to it. If you like the service, well, you'll join. And if you don't, Jim, why, you're free to answer no, free and welcome, shipmate, and if fairer can be said by mortal seamen, shiver my sides." Am I to answer, then?" I asked with a very tremulous voice. "Lad," said Silver, "no one's a-pressing off you. Take your bearings. None of us won't hurry you." "Well," says I, growing a bit bolder, "if I'm to choose, I declare I have a right to know what's what, and why you're here, and where my friends are."
"What's what?" repeated one of the buccaneers in a deep growl. "Ah, he'd be a lucky one as knowed that."
"You'll perhaps batten down your hatches till you're spoke to, my friend," cried Silver truculently to this speaker. And then, in his first gracious tones, he replied to me. "Yesterday morning, Mr. Hawkins," said he, "in the dog watch down came Dr. Livesey with a flag of truce. Says he, 'Captain Silver, you're sold out, ship's gone.' Well, maybe we'd been taking a glass and a song to help it round. I won't say no, leastways none of us had looked out. We looked out, and by thunder, the old ship was gone. I never seen a pack of fools look fishier, and you may lay to that. Well, says the doctor, let's bargain. We bargained, him and I, and here we are. Stores, brandy, blockhouse, and, in a manner of speaking, the whole blessed boat from Crosstrees to Kelson. As for them, they've tramped. I don't know wheres they are." He drew again quietly at his pipe. "Is that all?" I asked. Well, it's all that you're to hear, my son, returned Silver. Well, said I am not such a fool, but I know pretty well what I have to look for. Let the worst come to the worst, it's little I care. I've seen too many die since I fell in with you. And there's a thing or two I have to tell you, and the first is this. Here you are, in a bad way. Ship lost, treasure lost, men lost, your whole business gone to wreck, and if you want to know who did it, it was I. I was in the apple barrel the night we sighted land, and I heard you, John, and you, Dick Johnson, and Hans, who is now at the bottom of the sea, and told every word you said before the hour was out. And as for the schooner, it was I who cut her cable. I've had the top of this business from the first. I no more fear you than I fear a fly. Kill me if you please, or spare me, but one thing I'll say, and no more, if you spare me, bygones are bygones, and when you fellows are in court for piracy, I'll save you all I can. It is for you to choose. Kill another, and do yourselves no good, or spare me, and keep a witness to save you from the gallows.
I'll put one to that,
cried the old mahogany-faced seaman, Morgan by name, whom I'd seen in Long John's public house upon the quays of Bristol.
It was him that knowed Black Dog.
Well, and see here,
added the sea cook. I'll put another again to that, by thunder, for it was this same boy that faked the chart from Billy Bones. First and last, we've split upon Jim Hawkins.
Then here goes,
said Morgan with an oath, and he sprang up, drawing his knife as if he had been 20.
Avast there!
Cried Silver.
Who are you, Tom Morgan?
Maybe you thought you was captain here, perhaps?
By the powers, but I'll teach you better.
Morgan paused, but a hoarse murmur rose from the others.
Tom's right,
said one.
I stood easing long enough from one,
added another.
I'll be hanged if I'll be eased by you, John Silver. Did any of you gentlemen want to have it out with me?
Roared Silver. Not a man stirred. Not a man answered. Silver leant back against the wall, his arms crossed, his pipe in the corner of his mouth as calm as though he had been in church. Yet his eye kept wandering furtively, and he kept the tail of it on his unruly followers. They, on their part, drew gradually together towards the far end of the blockhouse, and the low hiss of their whispering sounded in my ear continuously like a stream.
You seem to have a lot to say,
remarked Silver.
Pipe up and let me hear it, or lay to.
Ax your pardon, sir, returned one of the men. You're pretty free with some of the rules. Maybe you'll kindly keep an eye upon the rest. This crew's dissatisfied. This crew don't vally bullying a marlinspike. This crew has its rights like other crews. I'll make so free as that. And by your own rules, I take it we can talk together. I ask your pardon, sir, acknowledging you for to be captain at this present, but I claim my right and steps outside for a council.
And with an elaborate sea salute, this fellow, a long, ill-looking, yellow-eyed man of 35, stepped coolly towards the door and disappeared out of the house. One after another, the rest followed his example and left Silver and me alone with the torch. The sea cook instantly removed his pipe. "Now look you here, Jim Hawkins," he said in a steady whisper that was no more than audible. "You're within half a plank of death, and what's a long sight worse, of torture. They're going to throw me off. But you mark, I stand by you through thick and thin. I didn't mean to, no, not till you spoke up, but I see you was the right sort. I says to myself, you stand up, Hawkins, John, and Hawkins will stand by you. As for that lot and their council, mark me, they're outright fools and cowards. I'll save your life, if so be as I can, from them. But see here, Jim, tit for tat. You save Long John from swinging." "What I can do, that I'll do," I said. "It's a bargain," cried Long John. "You speak up, Plucky, and by thunder, I've a chance."
He drew some cognac from the cask into a tin cannikin. "Will you taste, messmate?" he asked. And when I had refused, "Well, I'll take a drain myself, Jim," said he. "I need a corker, for there's trouble on hand. And, talking of trouble, why did that doctor give me the chart, Jim?" My face expressed a wonder so unaffected that he saw the needlessness of further questions. "Ah, well, he did, though," said he. "And there's something under that, no doubt. Something surely under that, Jim. Bad or good." And he took another swallow of the brandy, shaking his great fair head like a man who looks forward to the worst. The door opened, and the 5 men, standing huddled together just inside, pushed one of their number forward. "Step up, lad," cried Silver. "I won't eat you." "Hand it over, lubber. I know the rules, I do. I won't hurt a deputation." Thus encouraged, the buccaneer stepped forth more briskly, and having passed something to Silver from hand to hand, slipped yet more smartly back again to his companions. The sea cook looked at what had been given him. "The black spot! I thought so," he observed. "Where might you have got the paper?" "Why, hello, look here now, this ain't lucky. You've gone and cut this out of a Bible. What fools cut a Bible?"
"Ah, there," said Morgan. "There. What did I say? No good come of that, I said."
"Well, you've about fixed it now among you," continued Silver. "You'll all swing now, I reckon. What soft-hearted lubber had a Bible?"
"It was Dick," said one.
"Dick, was it? Then Dick can get to prayers," said Silver. "He's seen his slice of luck, has Dick, and you may lay to that." But here the long man with the yellow eyes struck in.
"Belay that talk, John Silver," he said. "This crew has tipped you the black spot in full council as in duty bound. Just you turn it over as in duty bound and see what's wrote there. Then you can talk."
"Thank ye, George," replied the sea cook. "You always was brisk for business and has the rules by heart, as I'm pleased to see. Well, what is it anyway?" "Ah, deposed. That's it, is it? Very pretty wrote, to be sure. Like print, I swear. Your hand a right, George? Why, you was getting quite a leading man in this here crew. You'll be captain next, I shouldn't wonder. Just oblige me with that torch again, will you? This pipe don't draw."
"Come now," said George. "You don't fool the screw no more. You're a funny man by your account, but you're over now, and you'll maybe step down off that barrel and help vote."
"I thought you said you knowed the rules," returned Silver contemptuously. "Leastways, if you don't, I do. I'm still your captain till you outs with your grievances and I reply. In the meantime, your black spot ain't worth a biscuit. After all, we'll see."
"Oh," replied George. "You don't be under no kind of apprehension. We're all square, we are. First, you've made a hash of this cruise. You'll be a bold man to say no to that. Second, you let the enemy out of this here trap for nothing. Third, you wouldn't let us go at them upon the march. And then fourth, there's this here boy."
"Is that all?" asked Silver quietly.
"Enough, too," retorted George. "We'll all swing and sundry for your bungling."
"Well, now, look here. I'll answer these 4 points. One after another, I'll answer 'em. I made a hash of this cruise, did I?
Well, now, you all know what I wanted, and you all know if that had been done, that we'd have been aboard the Hispaniola this night as ever was, every man of us alive and fit and full of good plum duff, and the treasure in the hold of her, by thunder. Well, who crossed me? Who forced my hand? Why, it was Anderson and Hans,
And you, George Merry. You say this cruise is bungled. Oh, by gum, if you could understand how bad it's bungled, you would see. We're that near the gibbet that my neck's stiff with thinking on it. And if you want to know about this boy, why, shiver my timbers! Isn't he a hostage? Are we a-going to waste a hostage? No, not us. He might be our last chance, and I shouldn't wonder. Kill that boy? Not me, mates. And as for why I made a bargain, well, you came crawling on your knees to me to make it. On your knees you came. You was that downhearted, and you'd have starved too if I hadn't, but that's a trifle. You look here. That's why. And he cast down upon the floor a paper that I instantly recognised. None other than the chart on yellow paper, with the 3 red crosses that I'd found in the oilcloth at the bottom of the captain's chest. Why the doctor had given it to him was more than I could fancy. But if it were inexplicable to me, the appearance of the chart was incredible to the surviving mutineers. They leapt upon it like cats upon a mouse. It went from hand to hand, one tearing it from another, and by the oaths and the cries and the childish laughter with which they accompanied their examination, you would have thought they were fingering the very gold. Yes, said one, that's Flint sure enough, JF, and a score below with a clovage to it, so we'd on ever. Mighty pretty, said George, but how are we to get away with it and us no ship? Silver suddenly sprang up and, supporting himself with a hand against the wall, "Now I give you warning, George," he cried. "One more word of your sauce, and I'll call you down and fight you. Civil you can speak and shall, George Merry. You may lay to that. And now, I resign, by thunder. Elect whom you please to be your captain now. I'm done with it." "Silver!" they cried. "Barbecue forever! Barbecue for captain!" That was the end of the night's business. Soon after, with a drink all round, we lay down to sleep, and the outside of Silver's vengeance was to put George Merry up for sentinel and threaten him with death if he should prove unfaithful. The next morning, a man hailed us from the fire that breakfast was ready, and we were soon seated around eating biscuit and fried junk. "Aye, mates," said Silver, "it's lucky you have barbecue to think for you with this here head. Where they have the ship, I don't know, but once we've hit the treasure, we'll have to jump about and find out. And then, mates, us that has the boats, I reckon, has the upper hand. Once we got the ship and treasure both, and off to sea like jolly companions, why, then we'll talk Mr. Hawkins over, we will, and we'll give him his share, to be sure, for all his kindness." You will readily believe how little taste I found in my breakfast, and with how uneasy a heart I set forth behind my captors on the quest for treasure. I had a line about my waist, and followed obediently after the sea cook, who held the loose end of the rope, now in his free hand, now between his powerful teeth. The other men were variously burthened, some carrying picks and shovels, others laden with pork, bread, and brandy for the midday meal. Thus equipped, we set out to the beach, where the 2 gigs awaited us. With our numbers divided between them, we set forth upon the bosom of the anchorage. As we pulled over, there was some discussion on the chart. The red cross was, of course, far too large to be a guide, and the terms of the note on the back, as you will hear, admitted of some ambiguity. They ran, you may remember, thus: "Tall tree, spyglass shoulder, bearing a point to the north of nor'-nor'east. Skeleton Island east-southeast, and by east, 10 feet. We landed at the mouth of the second river. that which runs down a woody cleft of the spyglass. Then, spending to our left, we began to ascend the slope towards the plateau. At the first onset, heavy, miry ground and a matted, marish vegetation greatly delayed our progress. But by little and little the hill began to steepen and become stony underfoot, and the wood to change its character and to grow in a more open order. The party spread itself abroad in a fan shape, shouting and leaping to and fro. About the centre, and a good way behind the rest, Silver and I followed. I tethered by my rope, he ploughing with deep pants among the sliding gravel. We had thus proceeded for about half a mile, and were approaching the brow of the plateau, when the man upon the farthest left began to cry aloud as if in terror. Shout after shout came from him, and the others began to run in his direction.
"He can't have found the treasure,"
said old Morgan, hurrying past us from the right,
"for that's clean atop."
Indeed, as we found when we also reached the spot, it was something very different. At the foot of a pretty big pine, and involved in a green creeper which had even partly lifted some of the smaller bones, a human skeleton lay, with a few shreds of clothing.
"He was a seaman,"
said George Merry, who, bolder than the rest, had gone up close and was examining the rags of clothing.
"Leastways, this is a good sea cloth."
"Aye, aye," said Silver. "Like enough, you wouldn't look to find a bishop here, I reckon. But what sort of a way is that for bones to lie? 'Tain't in nature." Indeed, on a second glance, it seemed impossible to fancy that the body was in a natural position. The man lay perfectly straight, his feet pointing in one direction, his hands raised above his head like a diver's, pointing directly in the opposite. "I've taken a notion into my old numbskull," observed Silver. "Here's the compass. Just take a bearing, will you, along the line of them bones." It was done. The compass read duly east, south, east, and by east. "I thought so," cried the cook. "This here is a pinter, but by thunder, if it don't make me cold inside to think of Flint. This is one of his jokes, and no mistake. Great guns, messmates. But if Flint was living, this would be a hot spot for you and me."
"I saw him dead with these here deadlights,"
said Morgan.
"Billy took me in. There he laid with penny pieces on his eyes."
"Dead? Aye, sure enough he's dead and gone below," said the fellow with the bandage. "But if ever spirit walked, it would be Flint. Dear heart, but he died bad, did Flint."
"Aye, that he did," observed another. "Now he raged, and now he hollered for the rum, and now he sang. 15 men were his only songmates, and I tell you true, I never rightly liked to hear it since."
Come, come," said Silver. "Stow this talk. He's dead, and he don't walk that I know. Leastways, he won't walk by day, and you may lay to that. Fetch ahead for the doubloons." Partly from the damping influence of this alarm, partly to rest, the whole party sat down as soon as they'd gained the brow of the ascent.
"I don't feel sharp," growled Morgan. "Thinking of Flint, I think it were, has done me."
"Ah, well, my son, you praise your stars he's dead," said Silver. "He was an ugly devil," cried a third pirate with a shudder. "That blue in the face, too."
"That was how the rum took him,"
added Mary. Ever since they had found the skeleton and got upon this train of thought, they had spoken lower and lower, and they'd almost got to whispering by now, so that the sound of their talk hardly interrupted the silence of the wood. All of a sudden, out of the middle of the trees in front of us, a thin, high, trembling voice struck up the well-known air and words, 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum." I never have seen men more dreadfully affected than the pirates. The colour went from their 6 faces like enchantment. Some leapt to their feet, some clawed hold of others. Morgan grovelled on the ground.
"It's Flint, by God!" cried Mary.
The song had stopped as suddenly as it began. Broken off, he would have said in the middle of a note, as though someone had laid his hand upon the singer's mouth. "Come," said Silver, struggling with his ashen lips to get the word out. "This won't do. It's someone skylarking. Someone that's flesh and blood, and you may lay to that." His courage had come back as he spoke, and some of the colour to his face along with it. Already the others had begun to lend an ear to his encouragement, and were coming a little to themselves, when the same voice broke out again. Not this time singing, but in a faint, distant hail that echoed yet fainter among the clefts of the spyglass. "Darby McGraw!" it wailed. "Darby McGraw! Darby McGraw!" Again and again and again, and then rising a little higher. "Fetch off the rum, Darby!" The buccaneers remained rooted to the ground, their eyes starting from their heads.
"That fixes it,"
gasped one.
"Let's go." "They was his last words," moaned Morgan. "His last words above board."
Still, Silver was unconquered. I could hear his teeth rattle in his head, but he had not yet surrendered.
"Shipmates,"
he cried,
"I'm here to get that stuff, and I'll not be beat by man nor devil. I never was feared of Flint in his life, and by the powers I'll face him dead. There's £700,000 not a quarter of a mile from here. When did ever a gentleman of fortune show his stern to that much dollars for a boozy old seaman with a blue mug, and him dead too?" "Belly there, John," said Mary. "Don't you cross a spirit." "Spirit? Well, maybe," he said. "But there's one thing not clear to me. There was an echo. Now, no man ever seen a spirit with a shadow. Well then, what's he doing with an echo to him, I should like to know? That ain't in nature, surely."
This argument seemed weak enough to me, but you can never tell what will affect the superstitious, and to my wonder, George Merry was greatly relieved.
"Well, that's so," he said. "You've a head upon your shoulders, John, and no mistake. 'Bout shipmates, this here crew is on a wrong tack, I do believe, and come to think on it, it was like Flint's voice, I grant you, but not just so clear away like it after all. It was like her somebody else's voice now. It was like her... By the powers! Ben Gunn!" roared Silver. "Aye, and so it were," cried Morgan, springing onto his knees. "Ben Gunn it were."
"We don't make much odds, do it, now?" asked Dick. "Ben Gunn's not here in a body any more than Flint."
But the older hands greeted this remark with scorn.
"Why, nobody minds Ben Gunn," cried Mary. "Dead or alive, nobody minds him."
It was extraordinary how their spirits had returned, and how the natural colour had revived in their faces. Soon they were chatting together with intervals of listening, and not long after, hearing no further sound, they shouldered the tools and set forth again, Merry walking first with Silver's compass to keep them on the right line with Skeleton Island. He had said the truth. Dead and alive, nobody minded Ben Gunn. The first of the tall trees was reached, and by the bearing proved the wrong one. So with the second. The third rose nearly 200 feet into the air above a clump of underwood. But it was not its size that now impressed my companions. It was the knowledge that £700,000 in gold lay somewhere buried below its spreading shadow. The thought of the money as they drew nearer swallowed up their previous terrors. Their eyes burned in their heads, their feet grew speedier and lighter. Their whole soul was bound up in that fortune, that whole lifetime of extravagance and pleasure that lay waiting there for each of them.
Silver hobbled, grunting on his crutch. His nostrils stood out and quivered. He cursed like a madman when the flies settled on his hot and shiny countenance. He plucked furiously at the line that held me to him, and from time to time turned his eyes upon me with a deadly look. Certainly he took no pains to hide his thoughts, and certainly I read them like print. In the immediate nearness of the gold, all else had been forgotten. I could not doubt that he hoped to seize upon the treasure, find and board the Hispaniola under cover of night, cut every honest throat about that island, and sail away as he had at first intended, laden with crimes and riches. Shaken as I was with these alarms, it was hard for me to keep up with the rapid pace of the treasure hunters. Now and again I stumbled, and it was then that Silver plucked so roughly at the rope and launched at me his murderous glances. We were now at the margin of the thicket.
"Huzzah, mates! All together!"
shouted Mary, and the foremost broke into a run, and suddenly, not 10 yards further, we beheld them stop. A low cry arose. Silver doubled his pace, digging away with the foot of his crutch like one possessed, and next moment he and I had come also to a dead halt. Before us was a great excavation, not very recent, for the sides had fallen in and grass had sprouted on the bottom. In this were the shaft of a pick broken in two and the boards of several packing cases strewn around. On one of these boards I saw, branded with a hot iron, the name Walrus, the name of Flint's ship. All was clear to probation. The cash had been found and rifled. The £700,000 were gone. There never was such an overturn in this world. Each of these 6 men was as though he had been struck. But with Silver, the blow passed almost instantly. "Jem," he whispered, "take that and stand by for trouble." And he passed me a double-barreled pistol. The buccaneers, with oaths and cries, began to leap one after another into the pit and to dig with their fingers, throwing the boards aside as they did so. Morgan found a piece of gold. He held it up with a perfect spout of oaths. It was a 2-guinea piece, and it went from hand to hand among them for a quarter of a minute.
"2 guineas!"
roared Mary, shaking it at Silver.
"That's your £700,000, is it? You're the man for bargains, ain't you? You're him that never bungled nothing. You wooden-headed lubber!"
"Dig away, boys," said Silver with the coolest insolence. "You'll find some picknuts, and I shouldn't wonder."
"Picknuts!"
repeated Mary in a scream.
"Bitch, do you hear that? I tell you now, that man there knew it all along. Look in the face of him, and you'll see it right there."
"Ah, Mary," remarked Silver. "Standing for captain again? You're a pushing lad, to be sure." But this time, everyone was entirely in Mary's favour. They began to scramble out of the excavation, darting furious glances behind them. One thing I observed which looked well for us: they all got out upon the opposite side from Silver. Well, there we stood, 2 on one side, 5 on the other, the pit between us, and nobody screwed up high enough to offer the first blow. Silver never moved. He watched them, very upright on his crutch, and looked as cool as ever I saw him. He was brave, and no mistake. At last, Mary seemed to think a speech might help matters. "Mates," says he, "there's 2 of them alone there. One's the old cripple that brought us all here and blundered us down to this. The other's that cub that I mean to have the heart of. Now, mates!" He was raising his arm and his voice and plainly meant to lead a charge. But just then, crack, 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 3 musket shots flashed out of the thicket. Mary tumbled head foremost into the excavation. The man with the bandage spun round like a teetotum and fell all his length upon his side, where he lay dead, but still twitching. And the other 3 turned and ran for it with all their might. At the same moment, the doctor, Gray, and Ben Gunn joined us,
with smoking muskets from among the nutmeg trees. "Thank ye kindly, Doctor," says Silver. "You came in about the nick, I guess, for me and Hawkins. And so it's you, Ben Gunn. Well, you're a nice one, to be sure."
"I'm Ben Gunn, I am,"
replied the Maroon, wriggling like an eel in his embarrassment.
"And
He added after a long pause,
how do, Mr. Silver?"
Ben, murmured Silver. "To think as you've done me." Ben, in his long wanderings about the island, had found the skeleton, he had found the treasure, he had dug it up, he'd carried it on his back in many weary journeys to a cave he had on the two-pointed hill at the northeast angle of the island, and there it had lain stored in safety since 2 months before the arrival of the Hispaniola. When the doctor had wormed this secret from him on the afternoon of the attack, and when, next morning, he saw the anchorage deserted, he had gone to Silver, given him the chart, which was now useless, given him the stores, for Ben Gunn's cave was well supplied with goat's meat salted by himself, given anything and everything to get a chance of moving in safety from the stockade to the two-pointed hill, there to keep a guard upon the money.
"As for you, Jim," said the doctor, "it went against my heart, but I did what I thought best for those who had stood by their duty. And if you were not one of these, whose fault was it?"
"Ah," said Silver,
"It were fortunate for me that I had Hawkins here. You would have let old John be cut to bits and never given it a thought, Doctor."
"Not a thought," replied Dr. Livesey cheerily. As we passed the two-pointed hill, we could see the black mouth of Ben Gunn's cave and a figure standing by it leaning on a musket. It was the squire, and we waved a handkerchief and gave him 3 cheers, in which the voice of Silver joined as heartily as any. A gentle slope ran up from the beach to the entrance of the cave. At the top, the squire met us. To me he was cordial and kind, saying nothing of my escapade, either in the way of blame or praise. At Silver's polite salute, he somewhat flushed.
"John Silver," he said, "you are a prodigious villain and impostor, a monstrous impostor, sir. I am told I am not to prosecute you. Well, then, I will not. But the dead men, sir, hang about your neck like millstones."
"Thank you kindly, sir,"
replied Long John, again saluting.
"I dare you to thank me!" cried the squire. "It is a gross dereliction of my duty. Stand back."
And thereupon we all entered the cave. It was a large, airy place with a little spring and a pool of clear water overhung with ferns. The floor was sand. Before a big fire lay Captain Smollett, and in a far corner, only duskily flickered over by the blaze, I beheld great heaps of coin and quadrilaterals built of bars of gold. That was Flint's treasure that we'd come so far to seek, and that had cost already the lives of 17 men from the Hispaniola. How many it had cost in the amassing, what blood and sorrow, what good ships scuttled on the deep, what brave men walking the plank blindfold, what shot of cannon, what shame and lies and cruelty, perhaps no man alive could tell. Yet there were still 3 upon that island, Silver and old Morgan and Ben Gunn, who had each taken his share in these crimes, as each had hoped in vain to share in the reward.
"Come in, Jim,"
said the captain.
"You're a good boy in your line, Jim. But I don't think you and me'll go to sea again. You're too much of the born favourite for me. Is that you, John Silver? What brings you here, man?"
"Come back to my duty, sir," returned Silver.
"Ah,"
said the captain. and that was all he said. The next morning we fell early to work, for the transportation of this great mass of gold near a mile by land to the beach, and thence 3 miles by boat to the Hispaniola, was a considerable task for so small a number of workmen. The 3 fellows still abroad upon the island did not greatly trouble us. A single sentry on the shoulder of the hill was sufficient to ensure us against any sudden onslaught, and we thought, besides, they had had more than enough of fighting. For my part, as I was not much use at carrying, I was kept busy all day in the cave packing the minted money into bread bags. It was a strange collection, like Billy Bones's hoard for the diversity of coinage, but so much larger and so much more varied that I think I never had more pleasure than in sorting them. English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Georges and Louis, doubloons and double guineas and moidores and sequins, the pictures of all the kings of Europe for the last 100 years, strange oriental pieces stamped with what looked like wisps of string or bits of spider's web, round pieces and square pieces and pieces bored through the middle as if to wear them round your neck. Nearly every variety of money in the world must, I think, have found a place in that collection. And for number, I am sure they were like autumn leaves, so that my back ached with stooping and my fingers with sorting them out. Silver, I should say, was allowed his entire liberty, and in spite of daily rebuffs, seemed to regard himself once more as quite a privileged and friendly dependent. Indeed, it was remarkable how well he bore these slights, and with what unwearying politeness he kept on trying to ingratiate himself with all. Yet, I think, none treated him better than a dog, unless it was Ben Gunn, who was still terribly afraid of his old quartermaster, or myself, who had really something to thank him for. Although, for that matter, I suppose, I had reason to think even worse of him than anybody else, for I had seen him meditating a fresh treachery upon the plateau. Once we heard a gunshot a great way off, and supposed the 3 pirates to be hunting. A council was held, and it was decided that we must desert them on the island, to the huge glee, I must say, of Ben Gunn. We left a good stock of powder and shot, the bulk of the salt goat, a few medicines and some other necessaries. That was about our last doing on the island. And one fine morning, we weighed anchor and stood out of North Inlet. The 3 fellows must have been watching us closer than we thought, for coming through the narrows, we saw all 3 of them kneeling together on a spit of sand with their arms raised in supplication. The doctor hailed them and told them of the stores we had left and where they were to find them. But they continued to call us by name and appeal to us for God's sake to be merciful and not to leave them to die in such a place. At last, seeing the ship still bore on her course and was now swiftly drawing out of earshot, one of them, I know not which it was, leapt to his feet with a hoarse cry, whipped his musket to his shoulder, and sent a shot whistling over Silver's head and through the mainsail. After that, we kept under cover of the bulwarks, and when next I looked out, they had disappeared from the spit, and the spit itself had almost melted out of sight in the growing distance. That was at least the end of that, and before noon, the highest rock of Treasure Island had sunk into the blue round of sea. We laid her head for the nearest port in Spanish America, for we could not risk a voyage home without fresh hands, and as it was, we were all worn out before we reached it. It was just at sundown when we cast anchor in a most beautiful landlocked gulf, and were immediately surrounded by shore boats full of Negroes and Mexican Indians and half-bloods selling fruits and vegetables and offering to die for bits of money. The doctor and the squire, taking me along with them, went ashore to pass the early part of the night. Here they met the captain of an English man-of-war, fell in talk with him, went on board his ship, and, in short, had so agreeable a time that day was breaking when we came alongside the Hispaniola. Ben Gunn was on deck alone, and as soon as we came on board,
He began, with wonderful contortions, to make us a confession. Silver was gone. The Maroon had connived at his escape in a shore boat some hours ago, and he now assured us he had only done so to preserve our lives, which would certainly have been forfeit if that man with the one leg had stayed aboard. But this was not all. The sea cook had not gone empty-handed. He had cut through a bulkhead unobserved and had removed one of the sacks of coin worth perhaps 300 or 400 guineas to help him on his further wanderings. I think we were all pleased to be so cheaply quit of him. To make a long story short, we got a few hands on board, made a good cruise home, and the Hispaniola reached Bristol just as Mr. Blandley was beginning to think of fitting out her consort. 5 men only, of those who'd sailed, returned with her. All of us had an ample share of the treasure, and used it wisely or foolishly, according to our nature. Of Silver, we have heard no more. That formidable seafaring man with one leg has at last gone clean out of my life. But I dare say he met his old negress and perhaps still lives in comfort with her and Captain Flint. It is to be hoped so, I suppose, for his chances of comfort in another world are very small. The bar silver and the arms still lie, for all that I know, where Flint buried them, and certainly they shall lie there for me. Oxen and wain ropes would not bring me back again to that accursed island, and the worst dreams that ever I have are when I hear the surf booming upon its coasts, or start upright in bed with the sharp voice of Captain Flint still ringing in my ears.
Pieces of meat! Pieces of meat!